to our special council meeting. It's Monday, November the 25th, 2023. I'd like to call this meeting to order. First of all, we acknowledge that this land on which we are gathered today is part of the ancestral land of the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, referred to collectively as the Anishinaabe. It is through the connection of the Anishinaabe with the spirit of the land, water, and air that we recognize their unique cultures, traditions, and values. Together as treaty people, we have a shared responsibility to act with respect for those environmental that sustains all life, protecting the future for those generations to come. So this evening, we have a discussion, and it's only a discussion on short-term rentals, and the presentation will be given by our planner, Randy Burke. And I would, for those that you are joining with us virtually, there is no decision being made this evening on short-term rentals. It's only a discussion. So Ms. Burke, I'd like to welcome you. And I guess I have to do this first. Okay, I have a motion by Councillor Bojan and seconded by Councillor Van Claveren that the presentation by Randy Burke, planner, regarding short-term vacation rentals in Plympton-Wyoming be received. Staff be directed to draft the bylaw for governing short-term rentals, and that staff set a date for public meeting on short-term rentals. All those in favor? Carried. Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Burke, now it's your turn.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think Ken wanted to do just a brief introduction.
Okay, Mr. Melanson.
Good evening, members of council. I will keep this very brief. Randy is essentially going to run tonight's meeting, and she has an overview presentation for you. I did want to flag for you that we have a number of folks participating online, that we have Corinne Nada, who is our CBO, our chief building official, who's joining us. But also we, for those of you who were on council last term, joining us online is John Hendricks, who was part of the team of MPG Planning Solutions that did the official plan update. You may remember John because there were questions about short-term vacation rentals during the official plan update. We've asked him just to be here to provide some, if there are questions that we may not be able to answer in terms of licensing, or essentially you need some sage wisdom. John has joined us to provide you his experience, having been in the public sector in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and they have regulated this for 10 plus years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Randy and we'll get started.
Thank you.
So thank you, Ken. I guess just first off, we can move to the next one. I just provided a bit of an overview of what we'll be discussing tonight. A quick, like I said, why we're here. We'll go over the definitions of a short-term rental, as well as go over what a short-term rental is not, just so that way we have the clarity. And we will go over specific regulation areas, including parking, noise, occupancy, zoning, and time frame, and then just talk about the proposed next steps. So first and foremost, why are we here? At the previous planning council meeting, staff provided council with an overview of what was found during our public consultation. With that, further discussion was had, and it was determined that more clarity and direction was required. So a special council meeting was requested. So that's really why we're here. So getting into it, a draft definition of short-term rentals, it's essential to note that this is draft. It can be changed to the direction of council as to what you guys see fitting. So it's all or part of a legally established dwelling unit that operates or offers a place of temporary residence, lodging, or occupancy by way of a rental agreement or similar commercial transaction for a period of less than 28 consecutive nights throughout all or any part of a calendar year. And if there's any questions throughout or comments, please feel free to, say them. It's, like we said, a discussion. And then going forward, what a short-term rental is not. A short-term rental is not any rental agreement over 30 consecutive days. Once a dwelling unit has been rented for 30 consecutive days, it becomes a long-term rental and tenant rights take effect. We have placed those up there just so that way we can keep referring back to them throughout the presentation.
So I just want to jump in here. We specifically have put this into the presentation to respond to your question, Councillor Wolvet, from one of the previous discussions we had on short-term rentals. And about what it affects, because there was a question of whether this would affect a long-term rental or someone, renting an apartment space for like 6 months to a year and whatnot. We want to make it absolutely clear that any of those long-term tenants, long-term tenancies where you are moving to Plympton-Wyoming, you are establishing your own residency and starting out in an apartment to save up for a house. And you're going to be in that apartment for north of 30 days, so obviously a long-term lease, this is not going to impact you. Thanks, Randy.
Councillor Rodriguez, then Councillor Bolgen, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just noticed it varies between jurisdictions, whether they reference 28 days or 30. Why is that? Since 30 is, anything beyond 30 is considered long-term or medium-term. What's the difference between the 28 and 30?
Your Worship, maybe I'll start and then if I'm gonna miss some stuff, so Randy will probably jump in, but my understanding is that the Tenancy Act kicks in when you're dealing with 30 days or more, because it is that long-term rental contract. Whereas short-term vacation rentals, which are done through a variety of different platforms, is under that. Did I miss anything?
No, so through your worship, again, I think it's just preference based on from place to place. When I did the interviews with some places, some said they did 28 days to provide them that kind of buffer day between the Tenant Act and the short-term rental bylaw, but it is really up to the discretion of council at this point.
That's why this definition is draft, because if there's a desire by council to tinker with that number, but to still stay outside of that long term, then we could look at that.
Councillor Bolgen?
Thank you, Your Worship. I just think, I know it's just important also for on that definition that it does not include motel, hotel, campground, couch surfing, or other short-term rentals, that there's no payment. We've got some motels, we got some campgrounds, so I think it's important that in there as well.
And through your worship, that could be included too in a section of, I know there's some bylaws that have a section specifically where it says what it's not, so that could also be included in under that section as well. Okay.
Councillor Rodriguez?
If I may just add bed and breakfast. Oh, I didn't think so. Maybe you did.
I'm sorry, we didn't hear that, Councillor Bolgen.
Sorry,
No, I didn't realize I forgot that one. Yeah,
or
Okay.
he may have said it and I didn't hear it.
Move forward there. So this is just to kind of get us into the areas of regulations. So like we stated, we did have open house sessions. In those open house sessions, we did provide the public with a chance to tell us their input of certain base regulations that could be implemented. So kind of what's coming up is exactly what we had asked the public. We had provided them to comment, tell us what's important. If they would like to see something maybe a bit more lenient or something a bit, more stricter on that side. So we wanted to provide council with the opportunity to provide the same guidance. And from there, we can have a further discussion if required. So the first one is response methods. Again, these are base regulations and can be drafted to whatever way council decides. And this is where the discussion piece will happen. So the first regulation or policy in the bylaw, specifically to response methods, would be all licensed short-term rentals in the town must provide a contact information. Ella will provide, depending on what everyone feels, if you strongly disagree, agree, so that way we have a visual representation as well, but please feel free to provide your comments on this one. Again, these are base policies to really feel if this is important or not. So I guess we could move to the next one as well. So if you do provide a contact information, is it important that the contact must be readily available within 30 minutes of a notification? Yeah, and we would love to have discussions surrounding these specific.
Want us to go line by line and get our comments
Yeah,
on
that would be great.
Um, Alex, do you want to start on that very first one?
So for contact information and availability?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a strongly,
Of 1 to 10.
strongly agree at 10.
10. Your worship, if I could suggest, if there's general consensus with what's being proposed, I think
For times moving on.
just for the sake of,
Is there anybody, let's just say, is there anybody that doesn't think that's a 10?
I can sort of, Mr. Mayor, I can live with a 10. I'm just trying to think of the emergency that it would have to be 30 minutes. Like if the place was on fire or if there was,
We're doing the contact information first, Counselor.
oh, contact, okay, yeah.
The one that we-
Yeah, yeah, but even that, it says the contact must be available within 30 minutes of notification. So if you're trying to reach a contact, you've got to be able to reach them in, or they get back to you within 30 minutes.
And so further, like a notification may include, sorry, through your worship, a phone call, voicemail, a text message, the town must hear back from them within 30 minutes. If we. Yes, that would be the response method. We would want to have them readily available to, comment on any of those issues. Throughout the public consultation, we did hear concerns of maybe that is too long, as well as maybe that's too short of a time frame. So that's where we're trying to grasp the opinion.
Mr. Sabansk,
So what I'm hearing, though, we kind of got into two parts here. So specifically with contact information, it seems like council as a whole very much wants the contact information for every short-term rental, and that's a 10 for everyone. So now then moving into the amount of time it takes for them to respond
Yes,
is what the next one we're on.
yes.
So
Counselor Rodriguez.
Oh, thank you. So in my business, we have what's called key holders, or call this. So that if one isn't readily available, you can move on to the next. So maybe to solve the issue, maybe there should be more than one contact person. So like not everybody's available within 30 minutes. Be stuck in a bathroom or something, a child. Pardon? Well, it's not for me to judge what people are doing. Or they could be away on vacation or out of the country, unavailable. There's many reasons why somebody wouldn't be available. But providing a backup contact or one or two backup contacts might be an option there to solve that. So that every effort is being made. So good,
Forgive me, then if somebody's not available in 30 minutes, is there repercussions to that? Is that something we're gonna discuss?
before we get too far into the weeds, do we want to be the ones making multiple contacts to multiple people? Or do we want to simply state that they must have someone available within whatever the time distance that the council agrees to? And then it's their responsibility to make sure that person gets out. Otherwise, you're gonna have your bylaw enforcement officers trying to track down people, going down a list and down a list until they find someone.
I think one additional. Probably.
Yeah, Mr. Bojan and then Mr. Melanson, please.
Thank you, your worship. So I'm wondering if maybe, so just to make it clear, instead of contact information, we're talking about the owner's information. And then on top of your owner's information, you have your identified people who are responsible for the property. So it can be a property manager. It can be family. Separate from the owner's information, I think is what you're kind of getting at.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You like that, Council? Mr. Melanson.
Through your worship, I was actually just gonna ask John to maybe pipe in terms of his experience with this sort of thing, because unfortunately, when the presentation's on, we can't see John, and if he's waving his arms, wanting to chime in, I can't see him, so I've sent him a note to say, just pipe up, but,
I'm on. I've turned my mic on if you can't see me, but through the chair, would you like me to comment on
Yes,
why it's urgent?
yes, John, please.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track, and I think that the 30 minutes is important, that someone be available. And I know I heard a question earlier, well, other than a fire, or some sort of emergency, why would people need to respond in 30 minutes? The main reason is you're going to have other unhappy constituents, and they have no recourse. They could call the police, of course. But what are the police gonna, they may be able to settle it down, but you want somebody to be responsible and accountable. And all of this is gonna have to it's not just through your zoning bylaw, you're gonna be wanting to use all the tools available to you legislatively. And the zoning bylaw is effective to a degree, but it's a very cumbersome, slow tool for enforcement. You need to be able to issue tickets and that sort of thing. Doesn't mean you have to issue tickets, but you or whatever they call them in enforcement. There could be building code violations, fire code violations, any number of things, but you want to have somebody who's going to be accountable quickly so that your constituents are feeling that they've been heard. And I think the biggest concern that I've run into in the past is that there's no repercussion. So I'll just put that out there, and that should help get your creative juices flowing here, and you get a better idea why it might be important to have somebody accountable quickly.
John, and I think, if I can just add, in relation to Councillor Bojan's comments, we were not getting terribly specific in what we've given you in terms of, like, it's this person or it's that person, mainly to provide. I'll just say we didn't want to be the administrators, so we were leaving it to the property owners to provide us who would be that primary contact, but yeah.
Anything else?
I think you can just use the word alternate, whatever. You need to list a whole bunch of people, just the owner or the alternate, as long as they got somebody who's gonna respond within 30 minutes.
It would be a primary and an alternate.
Yeah.
And through the chair, it's John again. I think that these are good notes to have, because if that's council's wish, these items can be picked up in, whether it be this, I wouldn't say the zoning bylaw is the best place for it. Probably a licensing bylaw of some sort. Doesn't have to be complicated, but that's probably a better place for it. And I gather, Ken, that what you'd be recommending is something later. Just how you implement all these things. So the guidance that you're giving Ken and staff right now is very good, and then how it comes back to you will be another, I would assume, another area of discussion.
Okay, thank you, John. Corinne, do you have anything you'd like to weigh in on this one, or are you comfortable with what we're talking about?
I am certainly comfortable with what you're talking about. And John's correct. It's more getting into the licensing bylaw piece and what an application looks like for that, and where we look for responsible people and an alternate. So I think we'll get that when we get further down the path. So we know it's important to council, like John said, so we'll certainly be sure that it's included when we do, say, the licensing bylaw or licensing forms and registrations.
Okay, thank you. And Corinne, if you feel you need to jump in here, we don't have you up on the screen. We can hear you though, but if you feel anything, just feel free to jump in.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Randy.
Okay, and so once it's ready there, the next one is, if required, the contact must be in attendance on site of the short-term rental within 60 minutes of being notified. So it is one thing to provide a notification and hear back from them to resolve an issue. And then there would be another regulation stating you must be on property if required.
So once again, council, keep in mind that as we're talking about this, these regulations may end up in the zoning bylaw, or they may end up in your licensing bylaw. For the ease of the conversation, we're not differentiating where it would be, we're just letting the conversation flow. But as John said, this stuff is likely going to be on the licensing side.
Counselor Rodriguez.
Thank you. So if we're kind of talking about language, not necessarily where it ends up. Again, in the wording. If required to be in attendance is not being specific, who be in attendance? So somebody on behalf of the owner could be in attendance, I would assume. Again, we have to deal with real life where somebody might not be within a 60-minute reach. So whoever they've provided notification of, that would be in attendance once they've been contacted. Some sort of language to allow for that clarity is what I would think is more realistic.
Deputy Mayor.
So if we're changing that contact to contact or alternate, then one of them should be available within the 60 minutes, as far as I'm concerned. One of them should be, if there's a complaint or any kind of an issue.
I just don't know how realistic that might be, and the whole point is we want somebody there.
Right.
Whoever they authorize to be there, who should be.
Contact or the alternate.
And
Your worship, the first thing to keep in mind is that whatever we create and bring forward to you, we're not aiming for perfection. This is version 1.0, and it's not going to be perfect. And things are going to happen that we had a base idea and it's probably not going to work. So what you're doing is setting the foundation. This is not to say that what you come up with is going to completely fail. But I think it's realistic to think about, you're going to have a good chunk of this that's going to work out really well. You're going to have some stuff in here that's going to have some bumps here and there that we'll have to try to figure out, and then, but it will generally work. And then you're going to have kind of one or two ideas that simply don't work. So Corinne's got her hand up.
Corinne.
Yeah, so one of the things, like, it's for the whole, I think council needs to be mindful that anything in the bylaw is not going to be 100%. And that's why we have the ticketable offenses, if that's the way council decides to go down the path. And one of the ticketable offenses could be fail to ensure availability of a responsible person or an alternate. So there is that option as well. Like, everything in this bylaw is subject to someone not performing, correct? So we just need to be mindful. That's why there's tickets and creating offenses for the enforcement part of, if we have to get to that point.
John's just turned his camera on. I'm not sure if he wants to.
John, anything from you?
No, I'm just having trouble with my dog, so I'm trying to keep my camera on when the dog's behaving. So I've got him out. I've got him out of my office now.
All right, thank you. Anything else, council, before we moved on?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Councilor Van.
I'm just, could you clarify, please, just whom is going to make those calls? Who's going to visit owners or managers at the site? Who's going to manage this?
Through you, your worship, and can chime in if you want or provide more. I think that would be a decision from council and enforcement. That is one of the largest questions that we have gotten from the short-term rental bylaw, and you know, it's not something that, and again, excuse me if I'm wrong, but it's not something that, you know, I personally will be going out and doing these things. I think it has to go to, how do we want this to be enforced in the long run, and how is it viable in that sense? And Ken, if you have anything else to add.
Well, I'm gonna jump in. I see John's hand too. So essentially, the enforcement side would fall, generally speaking, to your bylaw enforcement officers. That said, and Corinne can correct me, unless there's arrangements made to have someone on call, there are the county has limited resources outside of typical working hours. So part of what we would have to have a conversation with Corinne's staff about in moving forward is what does after hours service look like? And how fast are we able to respond to that? And what does that look like? Because obviously there's a cost in terms of, you know, if someone has to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, you know, these positions are union positions, there's contracts, there things like that. John, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to jump in because I don't want folks to overcomplicate this at this stage. I think it's really important for staff to have that conversation on, once they understand what you want as a council, who does what and why is the next step. And the police can still be part of the solution. There's going to be some, obviously some after hours work on the tougher cases, but a lot of the calls that are going to come in during the day, somebody complaining about whatever it might be. Your staff, your frontline staff are going to take those calls as they always do. And then how you deal with those calls is what happens next. Now, if it's outside of regular office hours, which often, you know, there's heavy partying going on somewhere, the police can be an option, but the police can then understand what the process is for contacting the appropriate enforcement individuals, whether they be with the county or with the township. So again, I think that this is something that you're going to want to review with your CAO and Ken, and they'll have to have that conversation first before you get clear guidance on that. I think what's important tonight is that you focus on what you want, and then what staff's job, as you know, is to implement what you want.
Thank you, John. Anything else before we move along? Okay, Randy?
Then just the final one here for response messages is just what notifications it may include. Currently, we have phone call, voice message, email. If there's anything else that council would like to see included on that list or as a form of notification, it may be included.
Also, do you have any thoughts on that, or has Randy covered those?
Covers them.
Carrier pigeon might be a bit much.
Who's making these calls, Mr. Mayor?
You're
The
calling,
response, who's making them?
So through you, your worship, once again, like this is where it gets into the conversation about who does what and where. But frankly, it's likely going to be some member of enforcement staff. Now, whether that's the planner during the day and a bylaw enforcement officer or the police at night. That's the weeds that we still have to get into after this discussion.
What I'm talking about is who's doing the complaining. I'm the neighbor. Who am I calling here to get a response? And we're not just talking bylaw enforcement officer, then we must be talking about somebody from the town.
Your worship, part of what I think John was trying to get you to focus on was the weeds of not just who's going to be taking the call from the staff side, but once we figure that out, how do we communicate that information out to your residents to say, okay, during regular business hours, here's where you contact, and when it's after hours, here's where you. So that's
Well,
still.
it might be simpler than that, Ken. I mean, and again, I don't know how townships got their call set up, but if you've got a general line to the township, that's where people are likely going to want to call if they don't call the police. And then there could be some guidance on the automatic answering machine on which extension to hit in order to, you know, get the appropriate response. So if it's just, again, this is the how to is got to come after the what. So the how to is, let's just arbitrarily say, hit 5, and then 5 will take you to whoever it is that's responsible for the enforcement. So they will get that call from a resident. These are the things that have to be set up once you know what you want to have done, and you've agreed on how that's going to be done, and you've got some idea what the costs are. Those are the details that you leave appropriately to staff to figure out. You don't need to worry about that as a council. I recommend you not, at least not at this stage.
I disagree with you. I think that's the important part of this whole stage is having very quick response, not 4 hours
Not disagreeing with you, sir, not at all, through the chair, I'm not disagreeing with your desire, that's not what I'm saying. You set the tone, you set the high level policy, then it's up to staff to implement that policy. So if you want 4-hour response, that's fine, you say that, that's the direction you need to give to staff. Staff will figure out how to make that happen. Listen, I'm just giving you, that's pretty consistent advice that you'll hear from those who are trying to guide councils on staying focused on their role, and then staff will implement what you need done.
Well, I
And it's, by the way, it's easier for me to say that than staff. So
don't think we're at that stage yet, Bob. We're gonna be working towards that, the way it's handled.
We'll see.
Well, and through your worship, part of whatever comes back to you for discussion and decision is going to include, it may not include like a standard operating procedure that is like 40 pages long and item by item, but it will provide you that overview of, so this is how we will achieve what it is you're asking us to achieve.
Okay, so I got Counselor Boja and then Mr. Sabansky and then Counselor Rodriguez.
Thank you, Worship. I just want to reiterate what John was saying there, just for council's sake. Our job right now, in my opinion, is to give direction on what we want. So is it responding in 30 minutes or 60 minutes? We tell staff this stuff. Staff will take our direction. They'll create a draft program, which then they bring back to us, in which they'll say, here's how much these will cost. This has everything you wanted, and this is what's going to cost. And then we have the choice to say, okay, we can't afford that. Let's make tweaks. Right now, I think we're just going to be wasting everybody's time if we get into the weeds here. I think we just need to stay high level, give direction of what definitions are, what we want included, everything that we want to see in it, and not worry about the who, the how, or the how much. Let's figure out what we want first. Staff will put it together, and then we'll be able to go further quicker. So I just want to put that out there. Just a reminder.
Clever.
Yeah, well said. I can live with that, friend.
Sabansky.
Suggested all, Councillor Bojan stole all my thunder on.
Go on.
Rodriguez.
I will know that because it's exactly what I was gonna say.
All right. 4 dittos on the.
Unsquared.
I do want to put that cart ahead of the horse though, but I'll hang in there.
Just tell them to buy a horse.
Ms. Flynn?
Just to loop back for clarity for staff, then, is everybody comfortable with the 30 minutes to receive notification and then the 60 minutes to have somebody on site? Is all of council in strong agreement of those two?
Everybody good with it? I think we are. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Flynn. Hey, Randy?
Okay, so now we'll move on to occupancy, so short-term rental occupancy. So the first regulation is no short-term rental shall rent out more than 4 bedrooms.
Keep in mind, council, that you could have a wide mixture of potential properties that would be seeking to be a short-term vacation rental. So what we're trying to do is set a cap in terms of what the biggest would be versus, say, if I have a 1-bedroom cottage, well, obviously I can't rent out more than my 1 bedroom. I could have more people because I could have a couch and I could throw some sleeping bags on the floor. But in terms of the number of bedrooms, I would still only be able to do 1.
Comments on that?
Well, in my example,
Because there's only 1 bedroom.
yes.
Counselor Bojan?
Thank you, Worship. I would, I think the maximum occupancy of a max of 10 people might cover that already. So if I have 6 bedrooms, I still can't have more than 10 people anyways. So personally, I think it might be easier just to set the max occupancy as it's listed in the next point that we're going to get to, rather than worrying about how many bedrooms. They could have 10 people in 10 bedrooms. So I just think if we leave the bedroom out of it and just focus on the 2 per bedroom plus 2, I think might be easier.
But if somebody had 1 bedroom, they could try and stick 10 people in there.
No, it's the maximum occupancy would be tied to the number of bedrooms. So if you have one bedroom, you can only have 2 adults.
Oh, well, you're leaving that in.
That's my recommendation.
Yeah, okay, all right, yeah.
Your first bullet point becomes redundant by your
Okay.
second bullet.
All
point.
right.
Yeah, so
Maybe if we could move on to the second bullet point, just so that all of. Yeah, so the suggested idea would be the maximum occupancy of 2 persons per bedroom to a max total of 10 persons. Is what Councillor Bochen is referring to.
You okay with that? Councilor Rodriguez?
Is there another bullet point about children? Okay.
It's just.
yeah, so yeah, we were just trying to take it, step by step, so that way we ensure that each one is getting its own time to be commented on. So we can move forward. In a sense, all of these ones do tie together in a way. So the next bullet point would be when a renter has children under the age of 12, an exception to the max capacity will be made and the town will permit no more than 3 persons per guest room. This is usually intended, if children sleep in, young children sleep in the same bed or there may be bunk beds of that sort, you can still accommodate those. While still, again, it would all refer back to the occupancy before, as well as the 4 bedrooms if we decided to use all 3 regulations, or if we decide we don't need the first one.
Any comments?
All in agreement of
General consensus.
the first 2.
To me. So we'll take that to mean that the first would be redundant.
Yes.
Kind of go that direction.
Okay, the next area of regulations that we have here is zoning and timeframes. So the first one is a short-term rental only be permitted in a residential use. So this is a use, not necessarily a residential zone. It may be mixed use, as long as you're allowed to have that residential unit there, it can be a short-term rental. General consensus?
Councilor Bozick?
Would that mean that we wouldn't be allowing a farm that's diversifying to have an Airbnb on their farm? Because I don't know if we want to unintentionally say that we can't do that.
Under zoning, you're allowed residential use on a farm. So that you'd be allowed to rental.
However, make a point, because the primary use of an agricultural parcel is agriculture. The house is technically secondary. So we could look at a provision that would, that a dwelling related to an agricultural use could also be included. Maybe I'll ask John, because that's something that maybe.
Well, yeah, I'm inclined to agree with the first commenter who said that residential use is a residential use, period. So residential use is still part of the farm operation. The house is part of the farm operation. I don't know how careful you want to be, but I don't know how much farm help buildings you have out there. So that's, I'm just throwing out a cautionary note. If you have a lot of farm help dwellings, that could, don't want to overthink it, but because I don't know what council wants to do either. But I think residential use is pretty clear, Ken. I think you've actually covered yourself. And you're talking about mixed use anyway, in other contexts, urban contexts, but so I think it's fine. Just take it generally. If council's supportive, I think you can move forward.
Hang on a second. Councilor Rodriguez is first, then you'll write down your points so you don't forget.
Thank you. So let's make clear though, when the gentleman is speaking to temporary housing for workers, it has its own category, does it not? It's not considered so it really wouldn't be a conforming use to use it as an STR because it has its own designation.
Through your worship, it would be accessory to an agricultural use. In terms of farm worker accommodation. But I think John's note is caught as a cautionary reminder is important for us to make sure that we don't cross that line inadvertently.
And by way of it having its own designation, we wouldn't, would we?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. I'm not terribly worried about it. I think memory serves, it's actually a defined use in the bylaws, so I'm not terribly concerned.
Deputy Mayor?
Don't forget. I'm just kidding. It says residential uses, not residential zones, so I think that clarifies it.
Councilor Bojan?
So I guess are we just trying to avoid someone having an STR in a commercial building? What are we trying to avoid by having this? Because usually when we talk about zoning, it's because the public don't want them in residential zones. So before getting into those weeds, I'm just wondering what this is trying to accomplish. Are we by specifying residential use? Because that would be everything except commercial almost.
Industrial, yes.
Through your worship, maybe the best way to respond to it is if you're thinking. There's some of the feedback that we received about short-term vacation rentals is that. In essence. There are some residents that feel that this is a commercial use that's being introduced into a residential area. What we're trying to do is. For lack of a better term, and I'm not gonna get this right, and I may ask John to chime in too. We're trying to sort of find that middle ground where. As a residential. Use, you have the ability now to rent your house. If Randy owns a house and I move to Plympton-Wyoming, she can rent it to me for a year. And that's perfectly acceptable. Now what's happened is the nature of tenancy has shrunk. And it's being used as cottages and short term. We're trying to basically thread that needle of how that works in the confinement of a residential zone. But if you're getting into commercial or industrial zones, that's where uses like motels, hotels, campgrounds, things like that will kick in because you then would have the opportunity to have multiple of these. So for instance, if memory serves me correctly, it's actually development in Edward that is for vacation rentals, but that is done purely in a commercial zone because it's multiple. John, did I miss anything? Did you want to jump in?
I don't want to confuse things. I think you can have. I'll use Niagara Falls as an example because we're doing a lot of on the development side zoning approvals for them, but their system's a little bit different yet similar. And they allow as of right short-term rentals in what they call a tourist commercial zone, and it's basically a residential area that's it's kind of in a mixed use area. It's a little older. It's a good way to inject some investment into that area. I don't know, so the context there is a bit different, but I can see there's different ways of approaching it. We've also seen a lot, like the Airbnb industry has changed everything. So what I grew up with, going to the cottage, no big deal. Everybody understood that. Now the landscape's changed. So now we're trying to bring in tools to manage what used to be pretty simple. So now we have cottages effectively, in residential areas. That's what we're really trying to manage here. But in theory, you could have a short-term rental in an apartment, right? It's residential use, and it's pretty common, and some investors have been pushing for that. Now, contextually, I don't know that that's a big issue for Plympton-Wyoming, but it's just the sort of thing that we're seeing. Like I say, I didn't want to complicate it. I think, Ken, your wisdom at the beginning of this to say, we're not going to get this perfect first go. We need to get something in place to work with it and figure out where the holes are and fill the holes as we go and revamp it in a year or whatever it takes. So we do the best we can right now from what we know and what we're seeing, and then take it from there as you work with it. It'll be a living document. Don't assume that if we don't get it right the first time, we can't continue to fine tune it as time goes on. So that didn't really answer your question directly, but
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess kind of what I'm getting at here is I think if we're gonna permit it in residential use areas, which is everything that's residential, then I don't even think it's worth getting into zoning bylaws and zoning. I think we stick with a licensing bylaw and not even worry about the zoning bylaw, because that's where you get into required meetings and all this, if you're changing the zoning. So if we're gonna permit it in residential uses, which is essentially everything except commercial and industrial, then maybe we just stay away from zoning and stick with a licensing bylaw. It's just my opinion.
Councilor Rodriguez.
Thank you. I agree. Council Bojan, and I looked at LPAC cases where they've kind of made those decisions in various cases where it is an existing zoning bylaw, residential uses, and the use of this home sharing is for very much a residential use, much as if you were living in it yourself, in the home sharing world where I think we could probably curtail those uses by saying you can't use it in a commercial way for like events like weddings, parties, bachelorettes, things like that. That's where we can kind of define it better, which I've seen in other licensing regimes.
Okay, thank you. Over here, we're good. You ready?
The next policy that will come up there is a short-term rental can only be available to rent for a maximum of 180 days per calendar year. The base regulation that are in other short-term rental bylaws throughout the province as well. So just hearing council's general consensus on this one. I know it provided a lot of feedback at the open houses. So a discussion surrounding this.
Councilor Woodman.
Yeah, when I first read this thing, to me, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Restricting the number of days, we got people right here in town that rent all year, maybe it's to a winter contractor for a couple of weeks or like. To me, that don't make no sense, putting a restriction on, it might make sense in some areas, I suppose, but what we're dealing with here, I just don't get that part of it. I'm just not sure what that means whatsoever.
Okay, did you want to comment on that? Then I'll go to Councilor Rodriguez.
Through you, your worship, it is in place in some municipalities to, like you said, limit the amount of time short-term rentals are ongoing, whether it kind of, when we were doing the interview process, there were some municipalities who said it helps stagger how many short-term rentals were on a weekend. It's all based on what council wants and what is suitable for the town of Plympton-Wyoming. So including this regulation is important because we get to see that, that is your opinion and potentially the general consensus of the council.
I just don't see where it fits in here in Plympton-Wyoming, that's all.
Councilor Rodriguez, then Councilor Bojan.
Thank you, Your Worship. So my understanding under provincial guidelines, when they did a whole thing on this in 2016, and from looking at what the intended purpose of this 180 days is in other jurisdictions, it was intended for areas where there's a housing shortage and or long-term rental shortages, which we have neither that exists in our jurisdiction at this time.
Clarify.
And it was,
Counselor, we don't have neither of those issues. Is that what you said? Sorry.
we have, not that I'm aware of, because we have plenty of land available for the next 40 years to develop housing. We've never been told that there's any unavailability of long-term rentals in our jurisdiction ever. I've never heard that brought up in any of this. And that's strictly in our jurisdiction where it is obviously a big problem in the bigger urban center. And that was the intent of the 180 days. It was also to prevent what's called the proliferation of ghost hotels, meaning like condos being secretly subletted as STRs as well. But I don't see where any of those exist here in this jurisdiction to justify the 180-day limit for us. As well, we don't have the availability of hotels and motels besides a small one at Reese's Corners. We don't have any other means of temporary housing or short-term housing in our jurisdiction besides this option. So you have all the seasons where it's needed for whether it's weddings, funerals, reunions, hockey tournaments, shutdowns. We quite often are the overflow for all of that, where we sit in between Lambton Shores and Sarnia, where that overflow hits our area as well. So I agree with Councilor Lovett. The intended purpose of this really doesn't fit our jurisdiction, in my opinion. Thank you.
Councilor Bojan?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think the 180 days. I'm going to assume that our short-term rental, quote unquote, season is the summer. So even if we implemented something like this, the highest season, it's not going to impact 100 days is a lot of time if someone's just renting their cottage in the summers anyways. So I don't know if we need to include this restriction, mostly because of it's next to impossible to enforce. We're not going to be able to know how many days someone books. So I just think from an enforcement perspective, we're never going to be able to enforce it. So
I gotta agree with you. My question, how do we monitor that? You need like register remotely. Now I'm down. The logistic nightmare.
Say one thing.
DC Jordan, yes.
With the 180 days also that being somebody who's lived on the lakefront for many years and listened to a lot of people. And I know one concern out there was people that just buying up property here and then making it Airbnb 365 days a year. The 180 could be there to kind of that put the brakes on that a little bit as well. So.
Good point. Mr. Melanson?
I wonder, Your Worship, if I could ask John for his thoughts on the 180, just to get a completely separate perspective.
John?
Sorry, folks, I got a little sidetracked here. 180, little bit of context.
So the 180, so one regulation that's being proposed, John, is that you can only rent out a short-term vacation rental for a maximum of 180 days per calendar year. So I was wondering your thoughts on that in terms of your experience.
Yeah, so I haven't missed anything then. I don't think I have a strong preference either way. My experience, we haven't dealt with that. And I'd probably not, unless there's something specific that council's concerned with, I wouldn't be looking for that. But that's not to say it's wrong. It really comes down to how you want to manage these. If you want to protect that housing for long-term housing, it's probably good regulation because people can rent it in those off seasons for long-term rentals, and that could be important. I don't have a strong feeling about it either way.
So if I could offer an idea, Your Worship, I would say that council is sort of neutral at best or split. The one thing that we can do in a bylaw is we can still put it into whatever bylaw we bring before you, whether it's zoning, licensing, or both. And if council, when you're making your decision, decides that this is really not what you want, then you can take it out. Because there's this idea when you advertise a bylaw that you're advertising what you're proposing, but if you're making the regulation less stringent than what is proposed, then you can make some deletions and changes before you adopt. That opens the regulation more and that doesn't require re-advertising, but if you're going to suddenly. If this is the base regulation and you're suddenly going to tighten it up and make it way more restrictive. Then you would have to then re-advertise because you didn't have those ideas. Or those more restrictive regulations within your bylaw. So it's one thing to advertise a bylaw and say, well, we're gonna add this rule and then take that rule out. If you don't have it there and then you add it, you could be in a situation where to require re-advertising.
So you're recommending that we leave it in for now?
I'm going to suggest that we keep it there for now, and then when we bring it forward. It could be that as we move forward and we start getting into the weeds of how to deal with things. That we figure out that it's really not workable either, and we could then just take it out and say to you, like. We told you we would put this in, but once we start mapping out how this would work, it just doesn't work. That'll be, as John says, the weeds that we're gonna figure out as we go. That's the next piece to then bring back for council's consideration.
Councillor Van Claveren?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That can kind of go both ways, what you're saying, Ken. So if, yeah, you implement now because it might be tough to implement later. Or it might be tough to lengthen it later too. So I think it goes a little deeper, in my opinion, that if we're going to potentially okay rentals. Then how long they can run is not necessary to enforce, in my opinion. If it's okay to do it, I'm not sure why there would be a limitation on how long you can do it for.
So through your worship, fair enough, if council really is of the same of the. It's not really an issue, then tell us so and we will not include it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Wolvet and then Councillor Basie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Ken, you made a couple statements there that you felt council was either neutral or split. I'm not so sure I share that point of view with you. I'd like to hear what council's got to say about that. We're gonna put this stuff in, put it in. If we're gonna take it out, take it out. I just don't see carrying something forward here, the council's here to discuss it, but I'd like to hear whether they do want to go ahead with it or they don't, not that there might be split or they're neutral. Like, I'd like a little more defined here what we're thinking of that particular item.
And that's what we're using the whiteboard for, is to really get some.
Yeah, well, that's,
Where there is.
Yeah.
We're unsure of where council wants to go.
well, that's, you made the statement, they're either neutral or split. Well, I'd kind of like to see on this issue where they're at.
Councillor Basie?
Yes, your worship, I agree with Councillor Wilbet and Alex that we're never gonna be able to police this. If it is something we want to put in, it'd make more sense to me that you can rent from April to October or something like that. In the winter months, there's no rentals. We can enforce that because the neighbors are gonna know the house has been rented for New Year's Eve. We'll, unless we're getting reports every week on how many houses are getting rented and what days they've got rent, like it's gonna be a nightmare. If we allow it to happen, either we let them do it or we put a time frame in when they can do it. The other way just won't work.
Councillor Van Claveren?
But again, we haven't determined why we would put a limit. So if somebody wanted to rent it out for Christmas Eve, I'm not sure we'd necessarily have a struggle with that. I know if contractors are managing these properties, if they wanted to, if we needed that information, how often they're rent, I mean, they would just have it like that. It's all on spreadsheets, or they probably even have programs and potentially apps that monitors all that. So that's probably doable, is to monitor it. I'm just not sure if we feel that's important to monitor.
Councillor Rodriguez?
Well, I mean, I agree. We need to look at why are we even putting 180 days in there? And all the guidance out there as to why 180 days exists to start with is to try and is because there's a lack of long-term housing or housing in general, and that was the whole purpose of these different jurisdictions starting to bring it in, because they needed a way to try and limit that short term and try and get more long-term availability where there isn't any. We just don't have that problem in our jurisdiction, nor do we have any other options for short-term housing in all seasons.
Melanson?
So your worship, what I'd suggest is we just poll council based on the 1 to 10 scale and get a sense of where you sit. And then if the majority of council is 5 or less, then we'll take that as direction not to include it.
Council comfortable with that? Council Wolbeck, what will you be?
0.
0. Deputy Mayor,
10,
Councilor Rodriguez,
0.
Councilor Basie,
I'm gonna be right in the middle. Why you have it, but I don't.
Councilor Bojan,
0, just proportionality.
So. Majority is on the no, so we will take it out.
So through your worship, just to get back, the next point would be a short-term rental must be owner operated, meaning it must be the registered owner of the property that is operating the short-term rental. Now, through my interpretation, owner operated would be you're the owner, you are taking care of the property. Potentially you would be the contact with an alternative. I know there's been lots of discussion about management companies. And here's a point, we have reached out to a couple management companies, and there are a couple in the area who do manage short-term rentals for owners. However, there are none that necessarily run them through a licensing program. But that is something, there are a couple individuals who stated that they would be open to discussing with council if that is a direction that they would like to go. Maybe that is a conversation for another time as well.
Mr. Melanson?
Before we get into any council discussion, I wanted to bring in John on this particular issue, mainly just to get his thoughts. And we've had some preliminary conversation about this idea of owner occupied and vacation management companies. So John, can I get you to chime in here?
Yep. And I wasn't distracted through that part of the discussion, and I apologize for earlier. This is it's something where likely it'll be a business opportunity, I would think, for some, but I don't think you want to require that the owners have a management company. I think it goes back to this business with the main contact person who's responsible for managing that site. And often, there's going to be people that just have 1 or 2 properties where they're doing this, and maybe others who have multiple properties. And those that own multiple properties may want to have a property manager looking after it. Those property managers may also be managing several other owners' properties. And my experience, certainly in Niagara, has been that that is the case. We dealt, in fact, with some of these managers. As part of the process, we engaged in this is about 10 years ago that we were engaging in our process. I've been long removed from implementing it, of course, but we're still around it. We see, and I live here in town too. So we see how these things are ongoing and evolving. But I think that you want to have that out there. You want somebody to be responsible. And I don't think you can always put it on the owners, because the owners may have let's say in theory, have 5 properties that they're managing and they can't get to them all in that half hour if they're all in trouble. I'm just, again, that's an extreme example, but it's the property managers are definitely something you want to account for, but I wouldn't require it either, because that's, again, it sounds like you folks are understanding the nature of business, and so it'll be a business opportunity for some, and others are simply just wanting to look at. They just want to do something with this property. It's maybe part of an estate. What do we do for the next 5 years? Well, let's rent it out, short-term rental, and then we'll sell it, or who knows. So it can be a wide range of examples as to how these short-term rentals are being and why they're being managed that way. So give yourself some room, but also make sure that you've allowed for that property manager to be responsible. And so the owner occupied, is it owner occupied? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not for short-term rentals, especially cottage rentals. If that's council's direction, that's fine, but I don't think that's realistically reflecting what we're really dealing with. Like the bed and breakfasts are fine, because that is owner occupied. You're right, that's fine. So if we're distinguishing between bed and breakfast and cottage rentals, that's a distinction. One has the owner living there and the other does not. Now, if council's saying we only want B&Bs, so that's a different, like bed and breakfast with owner occupied, that's a different matter. But if it's more of a cottage, and that's what I'm imagining, at least in parts of your township, is that it's a lot of cottage area. So you wouldn't want the owner, well, I wouldn't want to rent a cottage with the owner in it. I'll put it that way. So you can see there's such a wide range of things that you're trying to navigate here. So give yourself some room to and flexibility to navigate that appropriately for the different markets that are out there.
Okay, thank you, John. Mr. Sabansky?
So, and just for council's a little bit of background information, and most of you, I'm sure, are aware. Yes, we've had an influx of external owners from the GT area, but this area has historically been home to a lot of American vacationers, and a lot of those families still own cottages along the lake. So if those people who cannot use the cottages in the fringe seasons or in the winter wanted to rent their cottages out as a short-term rental, and we had that as part of the regulations, they wouldn't be able to do so, which could then preclude property owners who have been longtime renters here, but then don't live on site because it is their rental property. So by requiring them to be owner on the property or owner occupied, include those property owners from using it as a short-term rental.
Councilor Bojan?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think this is a good one for us to really give clear direction to staff on. And I'm going to give my opinion. I think there's an opportunity, and other places are doing it as well, that it cannot be owned, like a corporation cannot get a license. So it has to be a human being. So for example, it can't be an Ontario Inc. number that owns the cottage to get a license. Chances are, if it's owned by an Ontario Inc. number, it's an investor. And I think we've heard loud and clear that that's one of the main things here, is to prevent absent investors to continue to eat up property. So I think there's an opportunity to specify that a short-term rental license cannot be issued to a corporation. I think that there's an opportunity to, again, talking about people with cottages, that there are cities that have done this and towns that have done this, where you are only able to have one short-term rental license. So if I have a cottage and I say I need to rent it to carry it, that's fine. You can have your short-term rental license, but you can only get one short-term rental license. I also think that owner occupied, there is a difference between bed and breakfast and owner occupied short-term rentals, because bed and breakfast, you're getting into nitty-gritty zoning stuff, where owner occupied Airbnb could be, I have an in-law suite in my house and I rent it out short-term. That would be owner occupied. I think if we're getting into a licensing structure where there's a licensing fee, I don't think owner occupied short-term rentals, I think they should get a license, but I don't know if they should have to, depending on if we land on a fee, because the owner lives there. So the problems we're trying to address probably don't exist. Those are my 3 main points here that I think are worth discussing. So the incorporation, the Ontario Inc. numbers, it has to be owned by a person. Maybe one license per person, and owner occupied exemptions are.
Just clarification, Alex, what you're talking about there, I think we had some individuals in here that had 2 or 3 different houses. That are rented out for short-term rentals. That's not what you're calling a corporation, right? Are you suggesting they could only have one of those houses to rent out for short-term?
Well, it depends on which direction you go. So what I mean by the Ontario Inc. number is typically, if I'm a real estate investor, I'm buying property with an Ontario Inc. number. Typically, that's what's going to happen. So if you have a large municipality with a lot of short-term rentals that are owned and operated and scooped up by multiple properties to one person, they're usually tied to an Ontario Inc. number for tax purposes. So when I talk about the Ontario Inc. number and only issuing licenses to people, I think that helps prevent future properties from continually getting bought up by Ontario Inc. numbers for the sole purpose of renting 24/7 all year round. I'm not as tied to the one license per person. I just think that also helps prevent that. But if that helps answer your question.
No, it does, yeah, because we had a situation where somebody owns multiple houses, renting them out as short-term, that's their goal. So what you're suggesting, they would still be able to get separate licenses for each of those houses?
Well, it depends on where council goes, because if we say it has to be not a company and the properties are all owned by one person, and we did say you can only have one license, then you can only have one license. But property management, I know there was also a couple people that manage properties. I think if I own a short-term rental, I can hire a property management company to run it. I think that's something we should be totally fine with, because they're probably going to be responsible hosts.
Thanks, Alex.
So I got Councilor Rodriguez and John, you can come back in after that.
Thank you. So when it comes to owner operated, even if there is a management company that oversees something like this for someone, I still think it's important that the owner is the one who's doing the signing of the application and understanding all the regulations, and you know, whether they want to CC their property management on it, I guess it's up to them, but I think it's important that we do put the actual owner of that property be responsible for going through this process. And I was going to ask, are we able to limit how many licenses we can give out to an individual who owns property? But I guess you kind of answer that. We can do that.
Other places are doing it.
Yeah. So I don't know like what. I'm kind of on the fence about that part. I'm just not, I mean, to me, that would help get rid of these multi-owners, but your point, if there is someone who individually owns 3 properties and they're within this jurisdiction, they'll have more of that understanding of how this jurisdiction operates instead of a larger corporation who's just buying up properties. So the tough one, kind of weed through.
John, would you like to jump back in, please?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, first point, really good discussion. We're getting into the meat of things now. This stuff matters for sure. And this is the policy stuff that you want to sift through. Intrigued by the notion of owner occupied, because it does really solve a lot of the problems usually that you're going to have. I'll give you, for instance, where and this was with some B&Bs. There was a couple that owned 3 B&Bs. So allegedly they were living in all 3 of these houses at the same time. So you can have some creative entrepreneurs out there, as we know. So I think that if you're wanting to legislate owner occupied, just bear in mind that there'll be people trying to find workarounds as well. But so it isn't perfect. So I think it's really important to ensure that even the owner, sorry, lost my mic there. Even those that are owner occupied or allegedly owner occupied are licensed and managed in the same bylaw, but they might have a little different treatment in terms of, well, how the rules are implemented, I suppose. But if you, this assumes that you're willing to consider the management companies, but the discussion I just heard, maybe that's not, where one particular counselor wants to go. I'm not sure what the leaning of council is. I haven't heard enough of the discussion, but I think it's really important discussion. And I just wanted to flag that just keep in mind, entrepreneurs are very creative and are always challenging the rules, and I deal with them, or I have been dealing with them every day, as clients as well as on the other side of the counter. So anyway, just words of wisdom, but yes, I just important discussion.
Councilor Rodriguez.
Just a quick, are we discussing owner operated or owner occupied? I feel like they're two different subjects, correct?
Owner operated.
Okay.
The three, yes, we were talking about owner operated, but it sounds like there's three potential regulations on the floor that I think eventually, maybe once the discussion, I know Councilor Vasey wants to speak and of that, we could go through each one individually to decide what council's opinion on of each individual proposed regulation is. Just for staff direction.
Mr. Sabansky, then Mr. Bojan.
Just a suggestion to add to that list when council's ready to take the polls, non-corporate operated would be one, or non-corporate owned would be one that was also brought up in the discussions recently.
Yep, right. I was just gonna bring it, okay.
I was gonna say, for the sake of me taking it somewhere there yet, we'll take off the owner occupied piece, but I think the license, the corporation numbers and it being a person, I think relevant to owner operated, because what is an owner? So maybe we'll stick with owner operated, and my point about it not being an Ontario Inc. corporation is where I'll leave it for now.
We could get in, through your worship, we could get into that through a definition of what an owner is, but what an owner is not, depending on what bylaw it goes to. We forgot Councilor Vasey.
I can never forget. Councilor Vasey.
Yes, I agree with Alex on this. I like the idea of limiting the licenses. Right off the bat, it would probably be 2. Because if a husband and wife have a house and they buy another one to rent out, they're gonna put one in her name, one in his name, get one license each. I like that idea. The owner operated, I think is very valuable. Because you never have a problem with renting a house when the owners across the street living in the one. We don't have problems with those people. It's the out of towners, or like I say, somebody in the States is renting their cottage out and is oblivious and doesn't really care what's going on next door. But for the most part, we've got a contact for them. We've got whoever's managing the property for them. Somebody we can go after when things go awry. And like I say, limiting the licenses will get. Because if you're renting out multiple properties, it's now turning into a business. It's not. You're renting out your cottage because it's sitting empty and that'll help pay the taxes and all that other stuff. So. I agree with Alex on all of this.
Councilor Van Claveren.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I guess the tricky part is the ones that Councilor Rodriguez had mentioned too, that already own 3 or 4 or 5 and are actively short-term rentaling them for how sometimes decades. Now it's become more formal and more complicated and prone to legislation, and that's where it gets a little challenging. So if you bring it back to the core again, if we okay it, if we say it's okay, it is a lot trickier to put limitations on that. Like why 2 works but not 3, or 1 works but not 4, and all those types of adjustments.
Councilor Rodriguez.
So just a suggestion to that, maybe locally owned. You have to be a local of Lambton County or something. I don't know.
US.
Oh, yeah, we have all the US, people, but do they own?
Maybe the path, maybe for future. Potentially for future licensees, maybe we could start incorporating that on them, but present ones. It's pretty hard to claw that back, I think. And why would we?
Maybe just to think creatively here, which we're encouraged to do. What about grandfather, some sort of grandfather clause on existing? That have been in operation for at least 5 years or something like that. Maybe some sort of clause in the wording on that. I don't know what the exact time, I'm just throwing numbers out, but.
Mr. Shabasi, then Mr. Melanson.
If you're gonna consider a grandfathering clause, you'd probably want to base it on ownership and not operation.
Mhm.
Because it'll be very challenging to prove when to start operating as a short-term rental versus when that person who is operating as a short-term rental purchased it.
Melanson,
And the only thing I'll add is that a reminder that from a planning side, so in any planning regulation, we regulate the use, not the user. So all of this talk about looking at ownership is likely going to end up on the licensing side and not on the planning side.
sorry, Mr. Bojan.
That's why I think we need to go the licensing route. Not zoning or planning.
John?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'll just, I wasn't gonna comment on until it was just made, but I would say that you need a combination of both. One without the other, probably won't work as well. But for sure, you need the licensing. That's what's effective for enforcement, or most effective for enforcement. What I was gonna say on the land use rights as well, Ken, just a reminder that there's legal non-conforming uses. So if you want to consider that anybody that was legally established as a cottage, and I'll put it that way broadly, even if they don't fit under the new rules for whatever reason, if they were legally established, legally operating for, before the bylaws were passed. So you just want to keep that in mind as well. May not be a big deal at the end of the day, but I just heard some of the discussion got me thinking about that. So I just want to flag that. That's maybe more of a Ken CAO conversation for later on how all that gets implemented, but just keep your eye on. That's why the licensing will be important as well, because anybody, maybe there's a grace period or something for those that are operating their properties as cottages, and it's known, it's documented in some way, they can prove it. They get in, get a license, and then they've established that they're legal non-conforming if they didn't fit the rules. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, just through your worship, just to touch on that, there is a municipality that does do that they do the legal non-conforming, or it might be a grandfather clause as well. I would just have to look into that again. It's been a while since I reviewed it, but it is something I can go through and see how it works at that municipality and provide more information if that's something that council decides they could be interested in. Just for.
Okay, Councilor Wolvett?
Just to reinforce it, I think it's extremely important that we look at the grandfathering, because we're going to put a licensing and new rules in place and bylaws. People that are already out there operating shouldn't have to abide by the brand new rules. Most of them will, but I think it's important we don't put them out of business.
Councilor Bojan?
And just to be a little more specific, though, I think that, in my opinion, they have to follow by the rules. The grandfather clause would be the eligibility to get a license. So I think the grandfather rule would say, okay, Bob has 3 cottages already, so you're grandfathered into being able to have 3 licenses, but you still have to follow with every other piece of the.
Yeah. You're right. You're right on the money. I agree. I agree.
We want to be careful not to create so many loopholes that no one has to register.
Thanks for that clarification. That's what I meant.
Just being clear.
Ms. Flynn?
Is council ready to go over these 4 items, and we'll score them on the board to see where the consensus is on them?
I think we are.
So corporate owned, I just put it that way for ease. So, do we strongly agree that corporations would be allowed, or strongly disagree would be, they would have to be in the name of a human?
Let's do that one first. Councilor Wilbet?
I'm, Mr. Mayor, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what that means, because there's some corporations that own several properties in this municipality. I'm not gonna mention any names, but I know some big corporations that own homes all over Plympton County. As a matter of fact, they'd bring employees in from the west and there's your home, like it's there, so. What do we mean by that a corporation can't, if they had a manager coming in from Calgary and he's gonna be in the house for 2 or 3 weeks? Is that what we're talking about here?
So it would be who owns the property. So if it was individually owned, it would be just myself
Yeah.
owning the property, whereas if it was corporation owned, it would be myself, Lisa and Scott. And you wouldn't necessarily get the contact information for any one of us, or you could get it from one of us, but not the others. So you're kind of missing some key pieces and owners if it's corporate owned versus I'm the owner, I'm the only owner, and I'm your primary point of contact.
Okay, so I hate to mention any corporation, but let's say Dow Chemical owned 20 houses in Plympton County, and we'll keep those houses for their, is that what we're talking about here, corporate owned?
Correct. Yeah,
So they couldn't
business.
bring somebody in for 2 weeks?
It would be a business owning the house versus an individual.
Yeah. That's all, I just don't,
Mr. Shabansky, you want to comment on that one?
Councilor Wolbert, if money is not exchanging hands. And the corporation just owns that house, provides that house to their employees to stay short-term while they're on a shutdown or something, that's not a rental. There's no change of hands.
No commercial transaction.
Yeah, so that's perfectly fine. But if that corporation were to rent it out through Airbnb or something else, when they don't have their own employees there,
that would be,
then they wouldn't be able to do that because they're a corporation.
okay, fair enough. I'm just want to make sure I know what I'm talking about here. Thank you.
DC, Jordan?
Just that too, with the corporation part though, that there are some large farms in this area that are corporately owned, but they're only family owned farms as well, so. I know I got a place 2 doors down from mine, I think their farm's corporately owned, I'm not sure. That will be own the cottage 2 doors down.
Rodriguez?
Well, again, thinking outside of the box there on that one, because you make a good point. Most farms are incorporated. Maybe a stipulation that if it is a farmer operation, that would be an exception or something, putting in that clause. Because I think that's important. A lot of farms do own cottages. So it would be a matter of wording for staff to kind of work out.
Thank you. I see where they're coming from. I think just as a general caution, I feel like we have to be careful that we're not creating a bylaw to make everybody happy. We're not gonna make everybody happy. In fact, if you have a bylaw, that means half the people hate it and half the people love it. So I just think we have to be careful that we don't necessarily have to think of every single scenario. You have to figure out what we want. And hope it works, and if it doesn't, we can tweak it every year.
Rodriguez?
While I agree, I do think this one is an important point because I happen, like in my own neighborhood, there's probably 6 farming operations that own cottages right on my street. So, or maybe just having a stipulation that they own, that they live and reside, if this corporation lives and resides within the jurisdiction. To help alleviate that particular. I know we can't fix everything, but this one is, I think, a big one. That is important to recognize.
John, think of that.
Motion?
The only problem with that is I can create 3 Ontario Inc. numbers tomorrow, all with my address in Plympton-Wyoming to get around it. That's the problem.
And if you're
But are you an agricultural?
creating an exemption for agricultural though, if you're a large industrial, if you're a large residential corporation out of Toronto, you would go buy that farm and then go buy 30, create an Ontario Inc. company for that agriculture and then buy 30 cottages as Airbnb. So it's creating. We're in attempting to look after our agriculturally registered properties, we could be creating a significant loophole for advantageous developers and property users.
So that's why you have to show that you live here to close that loophole.
No, that wouldn't quite cut it either.
Well, you own a farm property here,
I got it.
registered here.
I just say that even if you live here, you could still go through that loophole. Still go and buy a whole bunch of cottages, the 30 that Adam referred to.
So it could maybe not a
Farmland.
GPA company, it could be a local property owner or a local business person who has farming as a base operation. But because they have farming as a base operation, they could theoretically go buy 10 cottages and rent them all out as short-term rentals and therefore circumvent the process as we have it. Because they would fall under a local company that lives in Plympton-Wyoming, who then has a farm corporation which can own those. So it's just, again, we want to be careful about by watering down the bylaw to create loopholes, we could make it challenging to enforce.
Mr. Van Claver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do we know how many corporations own multiple short-term rental properties? And if there is, and they own lots of them, is there problems because of that? Is it because they're driving prices up on resale? Is that the people that rent their property, are they more problematic? I'm just trying to see if it's a real problem or not.
So through your worship, just to comment, I don't have the exact number of how many corporations specifically own cottages or short-term rentals. However, I can state that within our open houses, it does seem to be a lot of the complaints come from places that do not have anyone local to respond to any issues that they might have. That is what we've heard multiple times throughout these open houses, and that response times or sometimes if they're more owner operated, we've heard that no neighbors say that they'll personally provide them their phone number, the owner, so they can easily contact. However, we have heard that those who live out of town, sometimes there is issues with response times. And to say this, it may be owner operated, but that doesn't mean that they can't have a management company as their contact to answer as well. You know, you just want it to be registered under, as Alex put it, our counselor put it, a person.
So if we did have that information sometime, like, is it a problem that we foresee that's gonna happen more? So the number of companies are coming in and buying 10, 20, 30, 40 properties. I don't know if that's something, and if they're not, are they doing it now? Or why aren't they doing it now?
Through you, I can definitely try to look up that information and go through the short-term rentals to see how many are kind of corporate owned. However, with the popularity of short-term rentals, it's definitely not something that it could be an issue. It may not. I can just go off of the conversations had throughout the open houses.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Vacy.
This is a good one that we could grandfather. We do not, I don't want corporate owned. So whatever on that puts me at the 0 or the 10. But if a guy's got one now, the grandfathering comes in, they can get a license for that. Anybody new with a corporation that hasn't got one now, they're not going to get a license 5 years from now. And that protects the guys that are here, whether they're farmers or whatever they are. From whatever date we start this thing out, if this is the way we're gonna go and allow them to have them, those ones get the ability to buy a license. Any other corporate coming in won't. That's the way I'm thinking.
Thank you. Mr. Sabansky?
So we're concentrating a lot on right now who should own and operate an Airbnb. A lot of the problems that we have in Plympton-Wyoming, and at least the concerns we're getting, are not necessarily who owns it. It's about how they operate it. So is the better way to concentrate on a licensing program that clearly illustrates what is required of those people who operate them and clearly provides a fine system so we can force those people to operate it correctly, than to necessarily get into the weeds of who should be allowed to own it? Or should we be concentrating on how those people who do own one are required to act in this town? The requiring them to act is easier because then you're not getting into the weeds with all these potential loopholes and grandfathering. You're saying, we don't care who owns it, but if you own it, this is how you act in this town, or we will find you.
So I got Counselor Bojan, Counselor Rodriguez, and DC Jordan.
I just scratched my ear. I didn't know that. That was an auction.
We learn from the best. Finest. Bojan.
Thank you. And just to go back to Councillor Van Claveren, just in fairness to Randy, because I brought up the corporation thing. So just to kind of explain where my train of thoughts coming from is it is happening. And it's what real estate investment is. I don't need to tell you that. If you're a real estate investor, you purchase properties in incorporated numbers. And so during COVID, when the Airbnb boom happened, that's what was happening across North America and beyond, is investors were getting into the market. So I know when we did, or when staff did the consultation, the number one, not number one, but one of the biggest things was absent owners, AKA investors, were buying properties. So that's where I was coming from with that piece. And then building off Mr. Sabansky, the enforcement piece is very expensive and it will be very expensive. So if there's ways to build in our program like this that naturally get rid of future absent landlords or investors that live in Toronto and buy a property and never come here, if that stops it, then it doesn't hurt to put into the bylaw for future from people purchasing up properties as investments. That's where I was coming from with that piece.
Counselor Rodriguez.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say the same thing, but to also reiterate that a lot of the feedback and one of the biggest complaints was, we heard from the public, was who is owning these. So it is an important piece to discuss for sure, on top of the enforcement side of it. So I agree that that needs to be some sort of built in some way. And the grandfathering, yes, Mr. Vasey does incorporate those farm properties. It would naturally, they would fall under that.
Okay, council. So we're going back to this, Ellen, you could take over now.
Corporate owning and one license per person, those are definitely very hand in hand. What's the point in having one license per person if you're pulling the platform? Wanna do that. So we'll start with corporate owned then, and we'll go back to Councilor Wolbit.
Yeah, in between a 5 and a 10 on that one.
6 or 7.
Give me a 7.
So that means you agree then, right?
That's true. Yep.
That they can be corporately owned.
Yeah, with the provisions that I talked about over there with the grandfathering and future will end that.
So you'd be the other way.
So then you go the other way.
Yeah, so 0 is that you don't want corporations to own it. 10 is that you are okay with corporations owning it.
So then,
Well, I'm still a 7 because of the farm conversation, because I know that's happening.
But we're grandfathering.
That could be
Well,
great.
they would be dead. Oh, well, okay, well, then let's take it back to it. Sorry about that, because I want to be clear on that one, because all these big operations own it, that's what they do. So, okay. Thank you.
I would be a definite maybe, so a neutral.
I would be a 0.
That's 0.
That's with grandfather.
Is mostly in disagreeance that corporations should not be allowed to own.
With the grandfather.
With the grandfather.
Yeah.
Provision.
I still haven't heard. If that's I still haven't heard the problem with having a corporation. I mean, it happened and they own, but I haven't heard the problem yet.
Councilor Bojan?
From my perspective, the issue. Yeah, that it's a stereotype, but. If you have a absent landlord short-term rental that has no screening. Issues constantly. The odds of it being owned by a corporation, AKA real estate investor that's not from here, that lives hours away. It's owned by a corporation. Typically,
And are they typically managing their own properties too?
yes.
I think that's the problem. Not the ownership, but the management.
Good point.
I mean, if the price was affordable, then all of us locals would be buying it up. It's that desirable. And because we're here, there's more chance that we're gonna manage it different than somebody that's away. But if somebody's away, then they need to have somebody local managing it.
The only way that you control that is if you put that in there as a regulation, because they're not really gonna care about that.
I agree.
Savansky?
We kind of already have though by stating that they have to respond physically within an hour. So you're basically limiting it to London and
Yes.
an area you're not going in.
That's
for.
already this.
Yeah.
So just by default, they disqualify themselves if they're trying to manage it from Toronto or.
Or they have to hire a.
Yes, or they hire somebody, yeah.
Company or private person who's looking to do that, but.
Yeah.
Councilor Rodriguez?
Aside from the fact that we kind of put in there, you have to respond within an hour. I think it should be stipulated that it would have to be managed locally if there's a management company. If you live, you'd kind of have to put that wording in. If you live outside the area, it has to be a local management company. Responsible, you kind of have to spell all that out.
And just to clarify too, I'm in the same brokerage as a manager. But I am in no way rewarded financially for that. We just happen to belong to the same brokerage. Just to be clear.
Thank you for the clarity.
Yes. So maybe we want to revisit this. I don't know.
Councilor Bojan?
I'll have to defer to staff for this one, but I don't think we could make a bylaw that forces someone to generate business for a property management, not even a specific, I just don't think we have the authority to require a property owner to purchase services for property management. I don't think so. But I would rely on our staff to look into that, or if they already know.
Ms. Burke?
So through you, your worship, I believe that's correct. Ken might have the definites, but we have had discussions about this of if we could require short-term rental owners to get a management company. I'm not sure that that's something that we could regulate. Mr. Simmons.
And even if we did, would we want to? Because maybe these corporations who got grandfathered then made good with their neighbors for once. And they hired their neighbor to manage the property for them. So by having them required to hire rent a management company, you're precluding that private individual who could do it for a small salary. Because so yeah, again, I think the regulation about response time within an hour is pretty hefty to force them to hire someone within an hour away to manage their property for them.
Mr. Melanson?
So through you, your worship, certainly not through the Planning Act. It goes back to use versus user. So we can't force that through the Planning Act. I'd have to, pardon me, I have a frog in my throat. I'd have to ask John to weigh in on the Municipal Act, but my hunch would be likely not, and if he did, it would be challenged.
Ron, did you catch that?
Oh, yeah, I did. And I don't feel qualified to weigh in on the Municipal Act. I think if it's going to be challenged, it's not the same as under the Planning Act, that's for sure. What I would suggest is this is at some point, Ken and your CAO will have to get some legal advice for you on the municipal act and licensing bylaw, but I don't think we need to fuss over that at the moment. I think it's important just to get some general direction, and then if I have some concerns about persons and that sort of thing. What is a person in law? A corporation is a person, but so there's all sorts of things that could be challenged. I don't think we want to worry about what could be yet or how. I think let's get some general direction from council, and then I don't know if that's what you were looking for from me, but those are my thoughts.
I was just trying to have a break so I could clear my throat.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think the only way we could force companies to use a third corporate party is if we're gonna specify they have to be local, then we would probably have to have an RFP process and where we pre-qualify contractors that meet set regulations. And then you give those set group of pre-qualified contractors to the residents, but then you're having staff maintain that pre-qualified contractor list, send out regular updates to the RFP, kick out those who are not, taking part properly, re-qualifying new ones. So you're adding a significant layer of complication to your licensing program if you're going to start to require outsiders to use those management companies and then have to pre-qualify those management companies. So it could be a challenge. You're kind of circumventing the free market at that point. So
I think
it might be a challenge.
there is precedence in other industries where you must use a professional. I'm not saying that's what we do here, but there is precedence. And so say there's 2, 3, or 4 or 5 management companies, that's only 5 people that you then have to manage as opposed to 500 or somewhere in between. So
it does preclude that, next door neighbor from managing it by themselves, right?
yes,
So I don't know if we get a lot of reward for the effort we'd have to go through to implement that. We can definitely help people looking for management corporations, find local
Yes.
management corporations that we've have experience with. We're never allowed to recommend a contractor, but we can always tell contractors that we have worked with in the past.
totally. Yeah.
Councilor Rodriguez.
I mean, you don't have to say a local professional company, you could just say a local representative, which could be the next door neighbor. So you
That
can
would
just
be-
mitigate it with simpler language. I am kind of concerned now about this corporate ownership thing after the gentleman, his name is John.
Yeah.
John's comments of the definition of what is a person? Which corporation is, I still think this is a really good conversation because it's a big one for the public and, as much as we're getting education, we're sharing that, what kind of challenges we're facing with all this, these words and possible regulations and what will stick and what won't right off the hop, so.
John, would you like to jump in here, please?
Yeah, although again, I was commenting about something else, but I'll come back to that. Yeah, the discussion about corporation is tough, for sure, but it has been great discussion, so very valuable. And I'm sure staff are, and there's been good dialogue with staff too. The management that in this case, you really haven't built the infrastructure, and that's not a criticism by any stretch. The infrastructure just isn't there because the requirements haven't been there, right? So as this bylaw gains traction over time and people realize they have to do certain things to manage it the way council wants it managed, you'll see an industry, you'll see the industry evolve out of that as well. Again, business opportunity, depending what the rules are, how they're set up. And I don't think you necessarily have to worry about are they quote unquote professional, but if you do have a list of companies to provide that service, that's good. Even in the professional planning business, our business, it's only recently where it's more and more required that you have to have an RPP, registered professional planner, signing off on planning reports that are filed with different municipalities. That wasn't always the way it was. So these things evolve, and you just have to allow for that evolution. And again, this comes back to, keep in mind, this is a dynamic bylaw, it's a dynamic process. So be flexible, and don't worry about everything just yet. Although it's good to say everything that's on your mind now, because that's going to help staff give you better guidance later.
Melanson?
First of all, thank you, Councilor Rodriguez, for the water. My throat is much better now. Piggybacking off of what John has suggested, and in light of the potential fact that a corporation is a person and some of those nuances. Council has given us direction to prepare this bylaw, but not a time frame. So, and council's been very clear, take the time we need to come up with this. And we've taken that to have this meeting too, because I think council very much wants us to not rush into this and create legal loopholes and challenges. And not to, I'm trying to think of the word, but it's starting to get late in the day. Not to devalue the conversation you're having, but there may be some things in this conversation about one license, one person, owner occupied, etc., that we may not be able to give you an answer today because we need to get a legal opinion on it. So it may be worthwhile that the occupancy piece, we bring that piece back to you after we've gotten a legal opinion from your town solicitor to say what are the challenges. I can say with pretty much certainty, none of this stuff's going to be in the planning act. This is a no-go in the planning act whatsoever. I don't know the municipal act well enough to be able to say whether you're on thin ice or whether you're not. And it may be best to get that legal opinion and provide it to council and then kind of go forward. I don't know. I'm offering up an option.
Yeah, Councilor Rodriguez.
I just wanted to clarify, because you said occupancy, we're talking about owner operated.
Well, I'm just thinking about, or sorry, was I looking at the wrong slide? Oh, we were looking at zoning and time frame. Sorry, I was just trying to refer to the slide that we were on.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We are talking about owner operated.
Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion to council then? We're gonna have to go through a lot of this stuff with our lawyer. So why don't we get council's opinion on the 4 items on the board? Know where you fall at, so we know where to concentrate our lawyer's opinion at, and then we can away from there.
Councilor Bowden.
As you say, and maybe we just say, what we're trying to do here is prevent investors from buying up property who don't live nearby, and let staff figure out what's the best way to do it legally.
Yeah.
And for what we're just gonna have to say it. Toronto and Hamilton are examples where corporations cannot own licenses for short-term rental, so it's been done.
Mr. Melanson.
And through your worship, just to Councilor Bojan's point, it may not look like we're taking a lot of notes simply because we are recording this on YouTube. So we have a recording that we can provide your legal staff just to, so that they can see the full discussion too, right?
That's understandable.
But we are taking it.
You're not taking? Oh,
Do we want to revise that question then, that do you agree that corporations shouldn't own short-term rentals in Plympton-Wyoming? And then go from there?
I mean, just based on this discussion, in my opinion, that's one of the only reason I say that is it's a clear way to prevent investors from scooping up property. So perhaps we flip it and say, that's what I'm trying to address here, and let staff figure out how to do it. So am I strongly in agreement that we should prevent investors from scooping up multiple properties in Plympton-Wyoming? I am. Maybe that's what we have to do. I don't know.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
Sit down.
I think that's a good idea. Yep. Councilor Wovet.
Well, I just want to go back a little bit about Adam's conversation there. I'm just not so sure we ain't putting way too much time into ownership here. I look at how this whole thing, I was the first guy to put this on the floor about problems with short-term rentals. I was the first guy to bring that to council. That's probably going back 3 years ago. when I brought that to council, that was due to certain complaints. Parking complaints, noise complaints. People are buying these things up, 2 or 3 of them, living in Toronto and not being able to get a hold. So they were down to earth complaints. And that's now this thing's building into, you know, who we're gonna allow to own property in Plympton-Wyoming, who we're not. So I like, it's a great conversation. I mean, it is, and it's all very legitimate, but the other thing that I recalled, and probably all the complaints that come in here, we know what those complaints are. Probably you guys have seen them. So you can speak to it too. What are those complaints? I never ever heard a complaint about a corporation owning properties or farmers owning cottages, or I never heard that one. This is all new to me tonight. So I'm not so sure that we're digging into something too deep into some of this stuff and not focusing so much on the licensing and the type of rules where the complaints were coming in, like noise, parking, stuff like that. So let's just, Adam touched on it. And then I'm just thinking as the conversation goes on, wow, we start saying who can own property and who can't, we're going to be into a whole lot of legal lawyers, and I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking, dude.
I think, Counselor, that's what the direction we're giving staff is to go back to our legal people, find out exactly for sure. As far as those other items that you mentioned, I think we've all experienced those. So I think that's probably on the agenda coming up next. I'm going to take one more comment from Counselor Rodriguez. We've been going for 2 hours. We're going to take a 5-minute personal break. So Counselor Rodriguez, you're on.
Thank you. I just want to clarify, Councilor Wilhite, that a lot of things have evolved since 3 years ago. And that's why this one was a very big one about investors buying up multiple homes and not having that intimate connection with those properties, and how do we address that? So that's the crux.
Yeah, good conversation, great discussion, but I'm just, I don't know, going in circles here, I think.
Well, okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. So those that are joining with us virtually, we'll be back in 5 minutes. So Lisa, can you put us on the holding mode, please?
Yep.
We missing tonight, Mike Steak.
The meeting, Ms. Nada, I believe you have your hand up.
No, that's just the mouse.
Okay. Thought it's gone.
Yeah.
Okay, Randy.
Okay, so, I would just like to. Okay, the next policy would be, an additional dwelling unit cannot be a short-term rental, just to keep the conversation going. Additional dwelling units is definitely something coming up much more frequently, with the new rental policy regulations. So overall, this council's discussion and that.
So when you're saying by that, you're talking about somebody having like a garage off the property, on the property, I should say, that could be used as a short-term rental as well as their house.
Correct. So through your worship, it would be if someone came in, you know, and like you said, wanted to put in like an additional suite, a secondary dwelling on their property. You couldn't put that in for the sole purpose of becoming a short-term rental, of any sort. With the primary dwelling.
Councilor Basie?
Well, yes, through you. I don't like this to the point where I don't know, I'm living there. And I put a second dwelling in, whether it's a granny suite or a bunkie house or whatever it is you're gonna call it, a ute or a dome or something. Cause then the people live there. You have more control over the rental than anything else we've talked about here. Or I'm a farm. What's the thing about the farm agriculture? I wanna put one coming up that I wanna build something so people will rent it out, stay on my farm, make money. We're gonna fight ourselves, but I don't see any reason, maybe not two rentals on or the main house or whatever, if the occupant is there. And he's got two or three of these little ute things, I don't see. Cause he still has to abide by all the other bylaws that we've got or restrictions that we've got. I don't see this one being a big issue.
Mr. Sabansky?
So I think what planning is referring to as dwelling units is a dwelling unit which has been created in compliance with the planning legislation, in compliance with the Ontario Building Code, and can be habitated. Secondary trailers, tents in the backyards, those are not units which are legally can be used for dwelling units. So I think this is more concentrated because those would be illegal no matter how you slice it. We're talking
So
about
must be odd.
granny flats, granny suites, a bunkie that's been created legally through the planning legislation and building code in the backyard.
So I have a farm and I build a little cottage out the back of the farm by the pond. Can I rent that out?
Provided it's in compliance on what the planning is saying today or proposing to you today, no. But for that unit to even be there in the first place, it has to be built in compliance with the planning act.
Still have to go. Yeah, it can't be
It can't just be a shed that's
a
on
tree
your bed.
house. It's still gotta meet all the bylaws and everything.
Back to your. Hurt.
Birds.
Could you explain that again, Adam, please, and thanks? Just how a yurt or a glorified tent or a.
So Corinne would have to correct me if she can, but a yurt, a tent, a treehouse is not intended as a dwelling unit or long-term occupation. It does not meet any of the requirements of the Ontario Building Code or the Planning Act. Therefore, even if we were to say that additional dwelling units could be used as STRs, those couldn't be used as STRs because it's illegal for you to occupy people in those units.
Okay. But if. But if I meet all those criteria,
Yes.
I still can't rent that out.
From what planning has on the board today, that's correct.
If I could, your worship, I want to take our conversation briefly back to. If you recall, we had suggested the 180 days and council gave us direction not to include that. What we're trying to do really is. Set some limitations about how STRs function within these residential uses. We've heard very loud and clear from the provincial government that we're in a housing crisis and additional dwelling units was mandated by the province. So much so that it overrides your official plan and your zoning bylaw. So Bill 23 has overridden those. We need to play some catch up with that. That's another matter. So what we were trying to do was to look at the possibility of if additional dwelling units are the province's direction to provide additional housing units that are potentially affordable, quote unquote, then perhaps we need to limit them to not be a short-term vacation rental. Now, that said, I think it was you, Councillor Vacy, that just said it, and I pointed when you said it. I think it's, as I'm hearing your discussion go, what I'm getting the sense of is, and this comes back also to a point that Councillor Bojan made about, well, why are we not putting this in commercial, for example? I think this gets back to, instead of maybe saying that a short-term vacation rental can't be in an additional dwelling unit, it's more about setting the number of short-term vacation rentals that you can have in a residential use. So for instance, under what the province has allowed for additional dwelling units in a single detached dwelling, that built building, you can have the house itself as one unit and then 2 additional units on top of that. So then maybe the better way to look at this is to say, okay, how many short-term vacation rentals do you want to have in that residential use or in that accessory use? So in your example, Councillor Vacy, where you said, and I may get this wrong, you've got an outbuilding by a pond and it's got everything that defines a dwelling unit. So it's got a kitchen, it's got, you know, cooking facilities and preparation facilities for cooking. It's got a bathroom and like living quarters, living room, bedroom. Well, that would be an additional dwelling unit. So if you're comfortable to let that be a short-term vacation rental, well, then maybe what you say instead is in a residential use, you limit the number of short-term rental units in a residential use. This then leads back to this idea of why we're not getting into the commercial zones, because once you pass that number, that's your threshold that then says, okay, now you're into the commercial side. And I would ask John maybe if he wants to, maybe I'm off course, or I'm not sure if Corinne wanted to, I know you had, sorry, go ahead, John.
Okay, well, no, I think you've covered it well. I think the additional dwelling unit, the context for that is definitely for housing, permanent housing, not short-term rentals. And so if you open up the additional dwellings to become short-term rentals, definitely defeating the purpose of that change in legislation. That said, I think I was tracking with you, Ken, that limiting this somehow, and I think the councillor was saying this as well, is well, let's just limit it to 1 per property. And I would say contextually that makes sense. Be careful though, because you know, you could have an apartment building. I mean, maybe you don't want to allow them in apartment buildings, so that solves that problem for now anyway. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I think in principle I'm following and I'm agreeing with what you're getting at. I just think we have to be really careful. And you know, this might be a question for municipal affairs, to be honest. More generally, Ken, you might want to ask that, because I think you know, what you're trying to do with this is right. But what the councillor's saying, I get that point too. So it's yeah, it's new. Like, this is new, so got to chew on that one a little bit further.
Councillor Wilbett, then Councillor Rodriguez.
I believe what we're talking about is already happening. accessory buildings, secondary buildings on property that are being rented out for short-term rentals as we speak. I know my own neighborhood for sure. That was a complaint that came in to me a couple of years ago, but so it's already happening. I appreciate the fact that this new Bill 23 come into place. I don't think we want people putting tiny homes in their backyard and then renting them out as short-term rentals, or that defeats the whole conversation we're having here tonight to add 2 or 3 more short-term rentals on a residential lot. So it's yeah, I know it's happening, but I don't think it should be. It just makes our whole situation here worse. We allow that. If they can move these mini homes each in a day, they move them into your backyard and okay, now we got another short-term rental. We got some pretty big lots out there in Plympton-Wyoming, so yeah, it's a pretty good point not to do it. Yeah.
Councilor Rodriguez.
Oh, thank you. Yes, and I do agree. I did speak a lot about what Councillor Vasey was saying in our last meeting about the reasons why probably should allow it on an additional dwelling, for the very reason, one of the reasons being that a lot of feedback we got was owner occupied. So this kind of helps mitigate some of that and allow for, and I even suggested we limit it to just one additional dwelling. So that it doesn't become like a multiple dwelling STR on one property. You know, the only reason why we have temporary housing, and again, I understand the intent of Bill 23 was to try and solve some of those long-term rentals or housing shortages, which again, we just don't have in our jurisdiction, nor in the foreseeable future with the amount of 30, 40 years available of land development. I wouldn't necessarily always refer to it as a short-term vacation rental, because again, this is temporary housing needs. So we actually had a presentation from a lady here back when we were first discussing this about how the different types of people that she houses in her home on a short-term basis for work, for waiting for their house to be built. You know, there's a lot of delays in the housing building market. So there's a varied amount of reasons, not just vacation. So I don't think we should limit it to that scope of thought as to why to have temporary housing, what the purpose of it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so through your worship, I think maybe with this one, we could just poll everyone to see what everyone's thoughts are. Just because I think there was a bit of back and forth there, so Ella, if you want to do your thing.
Do it in reverse this time, starting with Councilor Bougen.
Can you phrase the question?
Accessory dwelling units being allowed as short-term rentals.
One, yes.
You are strongly.
Want to vote on as it's phrased right now? And then you can add a second question on the single unit.
I am not in favor of additional dwelling units not being considered STR. That's a double negative, but I think you know what I mean.
I do not want accessory dwelling units as short-term rentals.
Go the other way. So, through your worship, just to pose it, so this specific one. So what I'm gathering is that an additional dwelling unit can be a short-term rental, but you can up to one short-term rental per property. Is this how?
Or per tax roll.
Okay.
It's just easier to rewrite that question.
Property.
Then we end in actual sign.
So additional dwelling units as short-term rentals, but only allowing one ADU as a short-term rental per tax roll.
Like strongly 10.
That's easy.
Bob kind of switched me on this because I can see a whole lot of problems. Arising from allowing it to happen. So even though I want it to happen. When it gets too far to that, just from the fire standpoint. And we haven't had it in our municipality, but I have heard through other municipalities in Ontario and a lot of times the Duff fire does break out. There's very limited access to get to the fire and everything else.
Well, thank you, DC, Jordan, we appreciate that input. That's good to know.
I'm gonna change my mind. I'm going to a 0. Bob convinced me.
Well, I appreciate your additional comments. An additional dwelling unit would have to meet all those standards as far as I'm. No, so I'm at a 10.
I'm at a 10 as long as the main building is the owner. And living there.
It would be owner occupied.
Okay.
Be a long-term rental as the
I
primary,
understand that.
and then a short-term rental as the secondary, but.
So I guess you'd have to add a note there as a secondary use. To meet what we're saying.
We are recording this, so your comments have been.
So it's a accessory dwelling unit, which is an accessory use, can be used as a short-term rental unit as provided there's only one per tax roll.
There we go.
And for me.
Based on the whole argument here tonight, why we're here, I have to go 0 because to add another 2 additional dwellings out in my yard and get a smart or a tiny home put out there. Now instead of renting 4 rooms out in my house, I rent those out. Now I can rent 2 more, my garage, my tiny home. We've just made this problem a whole lot
So-
bigger.
Under Bill 23, you can turn your basement into a unit.
Yeah,
You could not necessarily turn your garage unless you were to do the proper modifications. of the
yes,
building.
that's right. So that's.
So you can build 1 additional unit in your existing home, and you can build 1 additional unit outside your home.
Outside.
So you could put 1 tiny home outside your home, but the other unit has to be within the existing dwelling.
It still has to be.
In your home.
Exactly. So you could have 2 in your dwelling
Yeah.
and 1 in the backyard.
And only one of those 3 can be STR.
But what has stopped folks from doing that now?
Today, nothing. A year ago.
So why
Arizona
would
law.
we expect that to double, triple, quadruple next year or?
So like, I could, your worship, that is actually a fantastic question. And that is one of the principal reasons where residents become extremely concerned about this sudden shift. So I will put it to you quite simply. If I own my house today, as of Bill 23, I could add within my house 2 additional dwelling units anywhere in that house. And then I could add a dwelling unit either attached to, above, or standalone as an accessory building. If I don't want to do that, because I don't want to be a landlord, I don't want to have to report income, I am not interested in dealing with people in my basement because I happen to love my house and my privacy, nothing is going to change. Because I am the owner of that property. And if I don't do anything, nothing's going to change. It's only those individual landowners, regardless of what they are, like who they are, that decide, you know what? I bought a house, interest rates have gone up. I can't afford my mortgage anymore. I have some extra money, I'm gonna put a dwelling unit in there. I'm gonna have a renter that's gonna help me pay my mortgage. My grandmother is sick and ill, she can't live in her home anymore. I'm gonna put an additional dwelling unit in for her. I have a multi-generational family. There's a whole variety of different reasons. But if So that landowner doesn't choose to make any changes, nothing's gonna change. Nothing's gonna happen. All it does is it enables you to be able to do that. But you as the landowner are the one, you are the person who gets to make the decision. I'm going to do it or I'm not.
Councilor Rodriguez.
If I may just add to that point, in cottage country in particular, where you also have, where you're typically adjacent to the lake, you're also under the provisions of, the St. Clair Conservation Authority, which has further restrictions on things like additional dwellings, regardless of Bill 23 allowing them, there's still conservation authority provisions, so there still are other.
There's always other layers, yes.
Other layers, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Done there, Randy? Okay, let's move it along.
We'll move into parking. The first base regulation is the amount of parking spaces determined by the number of bedrooms, 1 parking space per 2 guest rooms. So this was kind of within the idea of the occupancy that you are permitted up to 2 people per bedroom. So you think how many people can fit into a car. It's kind of, you know, the thought process behind that.
Okay. Questions? Councilor Rodriguez.
Thank you. So this one is, I'm just not quite understanding, like. We have a parking bylaw in place. Should we not just be referring to the parking bylaws on this? And so, for example, if you've got a little. If you have a little cottage that you own, that you only has one. You have an emergency?
Yes, this week's, yeah.
It's emergency. So for example, there's a cottage close to me. It has enough room for 1.5 cars, let's just say. But if you're gonna allow, I don't know how many cars per bedroom or something, they're gonna end up with an overflow on the street inevitably. And I know in some of the other small cottages in Bonnie Dooney, that's a problem as well. They're very small driveways, like, shouldn't it just be as many that can fit in the driveway versus per bedrooms or whatever, and then follow the parking bylaws accordingly. Parking.
Sabansky, then Councilor Bojan.
So to reference the parking bylaw in the summertime does not restrict people from parking on the streets. It also does not restrict how many cars can park on the street. So the complaints we've gotten from some of those smaller areas is that the entire street is covered with cars and it doesn't leave any room for the residents or the residents' guests. And the problem we ran into is that everyone's meeting the parking bylaw because they're not blocking the laneway and they're allowed to stay over there overnight. So the parking bylaw itself is not strong enough to prohibit that over usage. And that's why planning is proposing a minimum parking space to ensure that there's some street parking left over.
And also the concern has to be too, is the fire trucks. There's a couple subdivisions where fire trucks can't get down.
They're hard enough to get down when there's no way parked on the street.
Yeah, very much so. Councilor Bojan.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that looking at this as a minimum requirement in order to get a license. So if I have a cottage and it's got 4 bedrooms, but I only have parking for 1 car, then I should not be allowed to get a short-term rental license for an occupancy of 10 if I can only fit 1 car. So I think it's more so minimum threshold to make sure people aren't renting their house, knowing full well that 4 cars are gonna show up and they have 1.
And that is common for those who rented Airbnbs. They'll on a lot of times on there, they'll say you're only allowed 1 or 2 cars max. So that is a common requirement on there.
Councilor Levet?
But could, like, even though they wouldn't have room for half a dozen cars, could they still get a license and say, okay, that's fine, we realize we can only park 2 cars in that driveway, the other vehicles will be parked elsewhere, wherever, down the road in a parking lot or something, they'd still be able to get a license, right? They just gotta meet the parking standards.
That's how you write the bylaw.
Well, right, I would say that it's no different than you go out to Paradise Valley or go to the Christian campground across from me. They don't all go down in the park and park. They park out in the parking lot because there's none of the parking spots on people's trailer sites. So to me, it would be an option that here's the rules around parking. To make sure you don't have any more cars in there than that, you go park them where you want, but not where's. It could be a parking lot down the road. It could be agreement with a neighbor, But to say, no, you can't get a license because you got 6 people booked. Is that fair?
I think it builds off of, if I want to open a business, there's minimum parking requirements I have to hit. So it's the same idea. So if I want to rent a cottage short term, there's minimum parking requirements I have to hit. It's the same as if you were to open a commercial building in that train of thought. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say if you're renting a cottage, you should have enough parking for
The amount of bedrooms you
the cottage you're renting.
Okay.
And if not, then you have to lower your capacity to meet what your cars fit.
Just asking the question. Thanks.
Mr. Melanson?
Yes, through your worship, I agree with Councillor Bojan's comments. Keep in mind, for a dwelling unit, it's typically 1 stall per dwelling unit is the minimum requirement in the zoning bylaw. And that public parking, so the street parking itself is a public asset, meaning that it's available to anyone. So if Randy and I, if she owns the house next to me, and I don't have a short-term vacation rental, but she does. So long as she has that 1 parking stall, she's compliant to the zoning bylaw. She's got a dwelling unit. She meets that requirement, same as I do. But I might have a massive family party. I can tell you, growing up, we did, and we would always let the neighbors know, because you'd come down our hill and all of a sudden you'd see a wave of parked cars. Because we have a big family and they were all coming in from out of town. Well, that's what the street is for to some extent, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's me, it could be a neighbor, it could be whomever. I think setting a minimum standard in the licensing bylaw is a good idea for the license. It's just, I think we need to be mindful of the fact that, there's certain parking realities that happen in residential areas that everyone has the same right of access to that public facility. I'm not sure if John's available. I don't know. Did we lose the Zoom?
I'm still here.
Oh, okay.
Just turned the camera off.
Oh, okay.
So we fired it up on my laptop, but I can't get Zoom to open right now. So
Yeah,
so
so we're not able to open it on the screen. We are still connected though.
Okay, so I'm not sure if John wants to chime in at all, but
No.
fair enough.
Well, I think this discussion's all valid, but yeah, there's really, you're kicking around important issues, and I think it's important to continue to kick them around. But at the end of the day, you guys need some guidance and direction from staff, from council. Where do you want to go?
Parking has definitely been the biggest complaint that we get regarding short-term rentals, next to noise and would be the next.
We hear it
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah, I mean, parking is going to be an issue no matter what, and that's just a reality. So yeah, to your point, Ken, I'm agreeing with you basically. That's why I really don't have much to add, because streets are meant for parking to a degree. It's when things get out of hand. That's really, and that's so if you have a short-term rental in your neighborhood and people are parking, I think that goes to the point Adam was making. When I interrupted him, I apologize, but if you've got those short-term rentals, they're parking out there, and they're doing it all the time, that's what's gonna create a problem. If your neighbor's having family over, yeah, okay, everybody gets that, right? But if it's happening every weekend, that's when, in my experience, the complaints came in, because it's one thing, after a while, it just gets irritating because people are having entertainment all the time. And I've had neighbors that did do that all the time, and it is irritating. But when it's people who don't care about your neighborhood, it's even worse. So you've got to regulate the parking for sure. And we have done that here in Niagara. Niagara Falls is doing it as well. You have to have some regulation, but at the same time, you don't want to put in rules that are going to hurt residents. But at the end of the day, you've got to have some parking regulation here. And that's important to the bedroom discussion you had earlier. So to me, that'll sort itself out if you're regulating or limiting the number of parking spaces. But if you limit the number of parking spaces, then people are going to end up on the street. So that's why, limiting number of people was an important decision earlier. I think that's going to drive your parking answers anyway. So
Yep.
Sorry, I said more than I intended to, and I apologize again, but it's just important discussion.
Good point. No, thank you. Thank you, John. Okay, so anything else on that one? Yes.
So I wasn't sure where to kind of bring this up because it would fall under noise maybe, and parking, and limiting the amount of people, which would affect the amount of parking they're using. I read in another licensing bylaw in another municipality where they put in a stipulation of not allowing short-term rentals to be used for event gatherings such as birthdays, parties, weddings, bachelorette parties, reunions, etc. It's meant to be just like hotel rooms or any temporary housing. You're not renting them to have those types of parties, and that's not their intent. So in this bylaw, they've limited to them, which would in itself, by putting some sort of provision in like that, would help solve some of the noise issues as well as the parking issues, because you'd be minimizing how many people are actually at this location.
My question would be, how do you regulate that, right? So if you have a group of young ladies who are having their bachelorette party, we're just here having a nice girls' weekend. It's no event to it whatsoever. It's an enforceability issue, right? So how do you enforce that?
Well, I guess we weren't getting to the enforceability part until later. With the weed part or something.
True enough, but
Yeah. Sorry, Ken.
I just asked what municipality that
You
bylaw
know
is.
what, I wish I wrote it down, so I'll have to find it out and I can send it to you.
We send it to Ken and Randy, please.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, Ella.
Move it.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. They're still parking the road. You can't stop them. You can't give them a ticket, can you?
and unless they're blocking a laneway or doing it in a manner that's in violation of their bylaws.
Yes.
Parking, like space, yep.
Rooms. I think we all agreed on something.
Let's just fix our parking at 11.
It is.
Is, yeah.
So for you, we'll move to the next one. The next one is just parking spaces must comply with the town of Plympton-Wyoming zoning bylaw, including size, parking surface, location, etc.
We're good with that?
What is the surface? Can you have gravel?
You can.
Need a parking spot.
This would be enforcing the minimum size.
Parking spot.
Okay, we're good?
Yeah.
Okay, Randy, keep her moving.
So moving to noise. So the first base regulation is no short-term rental may produce a level of noise that will cause disturbance to the surrounding neighborhoods and residents. So for some of these noise regulations, it does come down to enforcement. And I'll leave it at that for this one.
I wonder if we should do them all, because I
All?
think this is gonna be a big conversation.
Okay.
So maybe just show them all.
So, and then the next is examples of noise that are likely to disturb, include,
No, let's just leave it on this.
Yep. So loud music, outdoor or backyard gatherings, which were kind of mentioned earlier. Late evening or early morning disturbance, yelling or shouting, revving of engines or racing vehicles, fireworks, exceeding occupancy limits. These are, if there's anything else that should be there.
Deputy?
So can we just put that in our licensing bylaw or our licensing for enforcement? Or do we have to have a noise bylaw to be able to do that?
That is through your worship, that's a great question.
Correct.
Well, I was gonna actually start maybe with John to get some suggestion, I'm trying not to put John on the spot because, I don't know what Niagara did. off the top of my
We
head.
did have a site plan control agreement where we did put noise restrictions in there. And that went through without issue, and I do believe our lawyer did review that before we sent it out.
Yeah,
I don't think having these restrictions in there would be an issue per se. We're gonna have the whole bylaw reviewed by our lawyer anyways, so we can make sure to draw attention to this section.
So put them all in.
All those, the ones that are there.
They're great.
You know, it's including but not limited to, right? So
Yeah.
it'll be at the judgment of the bylaw enforcement officer what is excessive noise.
Counselor Van Claver and then Counselor Wilbet, please.
It's obviously, or certainly this is how I read it, that it's a spirit of what these statements are saying rather than creating an exact limit or an exact bylaw or because it's that again, it's all about trying to monitor. So I think everybody knows what noise is. Everybody knows what excessive noise is and they're expected to adhere to that.
you're starting.
Before you go to Counselor Wilbet.
John has his hand up.
Okay, John, would you like to jump in on this one?
Well, Ken wanted me to, so I thought I should let you know, and before you get too far into the discussion, just hearing some of that. So it's definitely going to be an issue for you over time, maybe not the first go around. You don't want to complicate the bylaw too much, but you're going to need a noise bylaw at some point if you don't have one. All those items are relevant for sure. But how you measure noise and proving it becomes an issue for court if you've got down the road. So again, your enforcement folks, you want to talk to them. Well, your lawyer, I guess, would help you with that as you move into this. But the amount of noise you have, are you exceeding the noise levels? How do you prove it? There are different ways to do it. Is it reliable? I think, that's going to be, to some degree, yeah, reasonable people come to reasonable solutions and conclusions, right? But we're usually dealing in court, we're dealing with people who weren't being reasonable, likely, often. So now you got to prove it. So just a word of caution. That's it, Ken. Yes, we did consider it. Yes, we've had to deal with it. They're still dealing with it. Enforcement's a messy business, anytime, but you've got to have some control over this over time to deal with the bigger problems. And again, it sounds like you're starting to get more complaints now. So obviously this is why you're dealing with it. This is an area where this may just need to be evolving, because otherwise you'll never get a bylaw. But the noise bylaw is going to be important. I hate to say that, but it does get more complicated as you go.
All right, thank you, John. Counselor Wilbet.
Yeah, this is a tough one because, we're singling out STRs here, but I can tell you when I read that list and I think of my own street, my own neighborhood, I think we'd be arresting them every weekend in the summer for sure, every house. Every one of these applies, so I think it needs to be more of a generic thing, that basically says, Plympton, Wyoming, it's noise bylaw. This is what you're not allowed to do or not. That is going to apply to everybody in this municipality, as far as I'm concerned, not just STRs, because like I say, this is common practice for people, especially out along the lake and their houses, to have their parties, their family gatherings, their birthday parties, and on it goes. So, unless it's something really out of the ordinary, then by all means, it needs to be addressed. But hopefully this is why we're doing the licensing. And so that they're gonna be read the rules and know they're not supposed to be doing this stuff. And then we'll have to look at the penalty, what penalties there are, but this is very generic to a lot of people in our municipality, not STRs.
Thank you, Counselor. Mr. Giles?
The only thing I would add to this is maybe adding more context to the fireworks piece, because the town does have a fireworks bylaw in place. That fireworks bylaw allows people to set off fireworks during specific times during the year. So you either want to not allow short-term rentals to set off fireworks at all, or they follow the same rules as everyone else, but there just needs to be more context around that, I think, just so that there's nobody challenging it.
Your worship, I would suggest that we would just defer to the bylaw then.
Sabansky?
And so to add to the comment I made about the site plan control agreement that we had that that measured noise, the tests that John noted are in there. And we'd have to put those tests in here to do that. So what we use there is to measure the noise. We used a decimeter. And we noted the location it has to be read from, which was at the edge of asphalt near the laneway. And then we set out a range. So that made it easily enforceable. So doing that in this situation might be a little more challenging, just because you'd have to establish how you're reading it, where you're reading it, and when you're reading it. So it's doable, but you'd be essentially building a mini noise bylaw within your short-term rental licensing program.
Thank you, Mr. Sabansky. Counselor Rodriguez, then Counselor Basie.
Thank you. So again, and I don't have the exact cases, but I'll try and find them. In other cases that were challenged, you cannot enforce something that would be discriminatory. And what that meant in context was that what's expected of anybody in a dwelling use, whether that person was living in it themselves or somebody was short-term renting it, you have to apply the same same bylaw across the board. So you can't just apply it to one and not to the other in the sense of what a dwelling use definition is. And that has been defined and decided by some LPAC cases. So I think the solution here is just like with the fireworks being listed here. And a lot of the point of this licensing for short-term rentals is because there's a lack of, and there was a lack of guidance and expectations of what the existing regulations and bylaws were in any given jurisdiction, which differ between jurisdictions. So therefore, you had to refine them based on what your jurisdiction has in place. And in our case, we don't have a noise bylaw. So to me, I think that one would be easily challenged. And we need to look at it. And again, I go back to what I suggested before, where it was implemented in another licensing bylaw about limiting uses for event gatherings and things like that might help solve or mitigate some of these concerns that resident neighbors are having in the absence of a noise bylaw that could just be referred to.
But would that fall under what you were just saying the other municipality did if you don't want to discriminate anyway, so you can't make this level of noise, you also can't have this type of function, then that should apply to the neighborhood also?
So, which is a good point, and thank you for saying that, because the other point is what are you measuring against when you don't have a bylaw in place to start with that sets a standard? So. Which I believe John has mentioned, that's what you gotta caution against, because you have no standard in place. to start with.
I think noise, I think everyone knows, truly, I do believe what the standard is. And they can argue it, they can push back against it, but I think we all know what noise is, and particularly if you're being excessive.
I would also like to point out that you don't know whether somebody is short-term or long-term either. So that's a challenge in itself. These short-term rentals pivot all the time. You know, they could have a weekend stay, they could have a 2-week stay, 6-week stay, 3-month stay. They pivot constantly. So it's constantly a fluid, that's very common, as you know. So again, there's no way of enforcing that without something that's across the board.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Vacy?
Yes, your worship, thank you. I think I'm agreeing with Counselor Rodriguez. I'm not 100% sure. I look at this,
Can I?
like the nuisance backyard smoke that when we're on fire department, we always get a call and the guy's got a hot dog over top of his bonfire, so it's legal. The moment you're impacting your neighbor is the way I would run it. I warn them, and if I come back here again, you're gonna get a fine and you can fight it out with council. Because I had one guy that would burn grass, they'd wait for the wind to blow in the neighbor's yard and then he'd light up some grass just to be in. And then the neighbor would wait till the wind's blowing the other way and then he would do it, so. Go to both houses and the next time I get a call, you're both getting fined and you guys can sort it out amongst yourselves. So this to me would apply to everybody in Plympton-Wyoming. And I'm not gonna care if my neighbor's having a party one night a year and it's his birthday and the loud noise and, you know, it's like the fair. You know, you hear the music once, fireworks once in a while, you know, it's the every weekend I can see, you know,
Which,
my neighbor's a partier. I go to bed at 9:30 and he's up at 3 a.m. still playing horseshoes and, you know, and it's getting rowdy because we're all having beers and we're having a great time. We need something in place so that when the bylaw guy goes out there and there's 30 people in the backyard, that he's got some teeth to say, shut it down. And here's your fine. Or the cops go up and like it. It's different. There's a guy sitting around a bonfire playing a guitar and everything, but if he's got amplified speakers and he, like I say, the whole neighborhood's hearing it, they gotta have something to go back on so they can stop it.
that's gotta be town-wide.
Yes. And like I say, it's no different than your open air burning. And if it's blowing in the neighbor's window, sorry, you're gonna put it out. Well, I'm allowed to I don't care. I'm putting it out. And you can fight it with someone else tomorrow. Right.
Thank you, Counselor. Mr. Melanson?
Yes, thanks, your worship. I just go back to what John and I have been reiterating to council throughout this process. It's not gonna be a perfect bylaw. This is version 1.0. What is good enough to start the process and learn? And I think Councillor Vacy said it best, like, what's a starting point to then say, okay, let's sort it out. And it may be that whatever you set gets challenged in court and we learn that lesson. Who knows? But a starting point is what we're seeking. I'm getting the impression that, you know, for the most part, council wants us to do something. And I think perhaps Councillor Rodriguez has a point in this other what she had mentioned earlier, where if you restrict certain events or certain activities, that might sort some of it out. So it may end up sorting itself out if we can, if that's an option for us to go down to.
I did find it just on that restricting uses. It's West Nipissing.
Thank you. Yeah,
So before we call out the vote, I'm hearing two distinct areas though. Where I'm hearing a fair bit of hesitation on limiting noise as part of a licensing process. But I'm hearing some renewed support for potentially a noise bylaw in the future. So would it be best to separate out the two? Should we limit noise within short-term rentals? And then you can provide your opinion there. And then should staff down the road look into a noise bylaw? It doesn't have to happen this year, it doesn't have to happen today. We have short-term rentals on the go right now. But that might be something that we should have a brief discussion or at least get some opinion on, because it's been. The majority seem to think that that might be the way to go down.
I think short-term rental noise has been a major issue.
Agreed.
I think it's probably worth, sorry, Danny.
If I can just add on to what Adam said. The one thing that council should remember, I know that there's been a lot of hesitation here in the past with the noise bylaw, but a noise bylaw can be passed with exemptions and the ability to get an exemption. So you can set a standard noise bylaw with the ability for people to apply for an exemption for special events, such as the fair or anything that's going on. So it's not fully restrictive. There's also bylaws out there that speak to farm machinery and harvest time that allow farmers to continue harvesting into the night without impacting the noise bylaw. So just keep that in mind.
Councilor Lovett.
Noise bylaw around this table has been a no-no for the whole time that I've been on this council. You know, a lot of people are really scared of this noise bylaw. It's going to restrict a lot of people from enjoyment, tractor pulls. I mean, I've had complaints about that. And realizing what Denny just said, is doable. You can make exemptions, but when you got to look at the things that are making the noise, we also got residential people here that are trying to sleep, and so that's a touchy one. I kind of like what Adam's talking about here. Let's zero in on our short-term rental talks, come out with something. It may not be a noise bylaw, but at least you can have the words around the licensing. And just leave that big noise bylaw for another day. I think it's just getting into the whole mess.
Well, we're here to deal with short-term rentals.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So just take overall noise bylaw off the board for now, you concentrate on short-term rentals. And if we want to come back and talk about a municipal wide noise bylaw, if we find that this limitation in here is either illegal or is not working, we can come back with some opinion on that.
Sounds good. Deputy Mayor.
Would it be helpful if we put restricted like noise between the hours of 11 and 7?
Through you, your worship, I was going to suggest maybe before we vote, there are two more regulations on the next slide. Just couldn't get a little bit. You can just pull them both up. Yeah, so
There we are.
must be to the satisfaction of the town at all times. Noise level to be limited to the satisfaction of the town between 11 PM and 7 AM or 9 AM on weekends and statutory holidays.
Suggestion, Nettie, where did you read that?
We're there.
Yeah. That's a good start.
And because we already have noise restrictions as part of one of our site plan control agreements, we can review that to see how we can work that in for those tests. To make it a little more enforceable if we're challenged. And then again, we're gonna have our legal team review it and they will point out any challenges which we may arise from adding noise into the short-term rental process.
Incremental noise, we have that go down and between 11 and 7 or 9 AM on.
I think that's a great starting point. I think it's for the STRs. Yeah.
Just one little question. If somebody, if we include that in short-term rental agreements. And there is a fine coming, is that to the homeowner or to the actual residents at the time?
We have to look into
the
it.
owner. It's the owner's responsibility. It's the only way we can. How are you gonna find a guy you're never gonna see?
It'd probably be the person on the actual license.
Yeah. I mean, like,
It would, by the time I got the call, it would have half an hour to respond back, an hour to get the volume turned down.
Okay.
Right?
so he could get fined 3 or 4 times, because he never got back to you. And you find for the noise.
Yeah. Never showed up in an hour. There's 3 fines right there.
Oh, I'm gonna come in at 10, yeah.
Again, no, reading the decisions I read when this has been appealed, you would lose from what I've seen. And I'd like to see some sort of legal on this. I know John has already said it could be challenged as well. And I'd like to see uses incorporated, rather. I feel like they're onto something and worked their way around this issue. So I'm a 0.
And because I'd like to see what's happening with.
Work itself out.
Just because an item is not on the slides doesn't mean we can't look into it. So we will look into regulating the uses too, because that could be very good mechanism to control some of these items.
And experience renting Airbnbs, a lot of them require or don't allow any outside people. So you have to specify how many people you're going to have in your booking. And then there's no additional people beyond that. So that can help with parties and weddings and whatnot.
Counselor Bojan?
Yeah, and it's worth noting that when it comes to noise limiting efforts, this entire program is doing it because it's encouraging responsible hosts, occupancy limits, so all of that stuff is gonna also impact.
Through you, your worship, to keep it moving. These are just some, we kind of discussed all of them, but just some ending. The goal is really to create a bylaw that is specific to the town. It is something to get started and it can evolve over time. So that's just something we don't want to forget. Staff will recommend a licensing program to enforce and monitor, which we have brought up multiple times. And then within the licensing program, we didn't go into kind of the requirements of what a short-term rental might have to provide. But there would be a set of general requirements, which would be a joint effort between building, fire, to ensure that everything we need is, we're making sure it's a safe short-term rental and things of that sort, like a site plan, parking, things of that sort. And then the final one is that this is just a joint effort between multiple departments, again, especially planning, fire, and building services, which is why we have representatives of both here. Just moving forward, these are the proposed next steps. It does sound like maybe these could change. Sounds like we have to look at some things and maybe provide some legal advice to bring those back to council to see what is an option in moving forward. So that could be added to the list as well.
Counselor Vacy?
I know I want to get out of here, but when we do that, just so we don't forget it, I've been to, because I do this a lot. I did it all through Ireland. The good ones will have a whole thing for emergency response, what your address is. All those kind of numbers set up in a spot, so that could be part of our licensing, is that's provided on the back of the front door or whatever, but it's very handy. Even the routes out of the house, if there's a fire, we always talk about planning your escape and all that, and when you're renting it, you're not thinking of any of that. That we designated the front step out here and go to the neighbors, this is your address, this is, or you need an ambulance, you're out on Hillsborough somewhere, I would have no clue, probably have no idea how to get there, let alone try and give somebody instructions on where I'm at. So
something along that line would be, like I say, the good ones have it, so. Cause they think of that stuff. Skip.
Yes, Mr. Rodriguez.
I just wanted to add that there's, in a quick Google, there's probably 4 or 5 others that have that uses. In their bylaws, so it must be on this one, that's all I want to say.
Mr. Bojan?
I think I'm on the motion, so I'm just gonna put forward an option to amend it a bit. I know this process has been confusing in general already for the public, because when are we making a decision with what's the program? I would like, if we're looking at a licensing bylaw, not zoning, so we don't have any statutory public meetings. I would like to switch that, because I still want to be able to send something out to the public for feedback, but I don't think it should happen until we've actually approved something in principle. Otherwise, we're just gonna go in circles again like tonight. So I'd like to amend the motion that it's just to direct staff to use today's feedback and direction to create a program option, whether it's with a couple alternatives to consider or whatnot. And then after council's on the same page or something, then we go to the public.
So I have a question, Emery, and I'm glad you brought that up, Council Bojan, because the clerk and I were just discussing that. The next meeting that we had with the public, was that just a public meeting for input or to share what we have? I just need a refresher on that. So what was the plan that we're?
So through your worship, I think our feeling was that based on this guidance of tonight, we would be in a position to create a bylaw from the planning perspective, but also potentially from a licensing perspective, and bring the two back to council, because the planning act piece, so the zoning bylaw requires you to have a public meeting before you make a decision to approve it. So I think from our perspective, we were looking at a holistic approach of if council was willing to consider a licensing system, which I get the impression, I think our concern was you were not going to go down that road, that this would be the biggest part of the discussion. What we're seeing is that actually isn't the case. You've latched on to this licensing regardless of how easy or complicated it is. We want to bring the two of them back because I think it makes sense to bring both of these pieces back, even though you don't need to do a public meeting for a municipal act bylaw, which the licensing is, just so that the public can react to all of it as one piece, because it doesn't make sense to break it into two when the public could have concerns or suggestions or ideas or thoughts on both sides of the issue. The other thing to keep in mind too, your worship, is that you're not required when you have the public meeting to actually pass the bylaw. You don't have to make a decision that night. So one option that council could do is once the two are put together, you then proceed to have the public meeting, knowing that the public meeting is statutory for the planning side, but you're having it for all. Everyone comes forward and provides their thoughts. But there's yet again, no decision that night, because you have the bylaws before you. If you hear overwhelming public feedback about one or two different things to add or to draw or to change, then you have options to be able to do that. And then the bylaws, as they're changed, depending on the public's input, then come back before you for council to consider, because there is a mechanism within the Planning Act to make changes to the bylaw, and council consider those changes minor without having to re-advertise the bylaw. But that, I mean, I don't want to get into semantics in the weeds. We can deal with that if that was the case.
Since we're going through the municipal act, we don't really need to advertise it necessarily, so.
Exactly.
But out a draft bylaw, we have just numbers, 30-day public period where it's out in the public for their comments. Within that 30-day period, we have an open house where they can come in and provide their comments to council as a whole. We take those comments, we review them at a meeting after the consultation period. Then we draft the final bylaw, and then that final bylaw comes to you another meeting for final endorsement. So it'll be a bit of a process, but you're ensuring that the public gets an opportunity to comment on it. You're getting a opportunity to digest the whole bylaw, and then it's being passed in form that we can enforce at a cost that you're comfortable expending to enforce it.
You're also achieving what would be called procedural fairness. So you're giving the public, all of the public, further opportunities to engage. So from a perspective of, well, I didn't have an opportunity, they've now had, the public, your residents have had the opportunity to submit comments. In fact, I don't believe we've closed it off. They can continue, residents can continue to submit feedback now. This would then open up other opportunities, and then council could make a decision.
Councilor Bojan?
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify that I'm not saying we're trying to circumvent public feedback. I think we need to do public feedback. But I don't see anywhere in this discussion why we need to do zoning or planning. This can be done with a licensing bylaw, and we don't need to worry about the nitty-gritty requirements of planning and zoning. So I still think we should take a bylaw to the public and get feedback. I just don't think we need to worry about the zoning and the planning requirements by making sure we do this first, then this, then this, then this, when the public's already angry that we've been dragging our feet on this. So if we can expedite the process and still get public feedback by focusing on a licensing program and not planning, I think that might be the best way forward. That's just my opinion.
If I could make a suggestion, I think your point's fair, Councillor Bojan. But I don't think that we're going to necessarily completely avoid the planning side, because we may have to define a use or something like that. But I like where you're going. I really do.
I think we talked about some legal aspect in there too, to confirm a few.
Can I maybe throw this out on the table, your worship, just for council's feedback? Regardless of whatever happens, you've made it very clear you want to continue to engage your citizens, and B, you want us to develop a system. I don't know at this point with any certainty that we can avoid any changes to your zoning bylaw. That's not to say that as we get into this, that it may be that we can. I would suggest whatever motion you give, leave it to staff to kind of navigate this process and figure it out. I would hate for the motion to give a direction and then all of a sudden we're kind of stuck. And then we have to come back, but I mean, maybe I'm worrying for nothing.
I think the biggest part of this motion is it specifies that next is hosting a public meeting, when that's not probably the case. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, no, I get where you're going.
Maybe worst case scenario, if we can avoid the planning side as much as possible, maybe it's a minor ZBA, which we have to, with a minor amendment defining a short-term rental. And that the fact that it can occur only in a residential. And that's a fairly short, straightforward zoning bylaw amendment. That probably wouldn't take any longer than us drafting up the licensing bylaw, probably receiving consultation. You could do both those processes concurrently and probably get done at the same time. So as long as we don't get too deep into the weeds of the zoning bylaw, which can get quite complicated.
Lynn, and then Councilor Rodriguez.
Just on the topic of the new bylaw amendment, we would need to do one for parking, because right now for residential zonings, our bylaw requires 1.5 space or 1.1 space per residential dwelling. So if we're doing 1 space per 2 rooms, we would need to specify that for short-term rentals in our zoning bylaw. So I think ultimately we are going to need to define a short-term rental and.
Councilor Rodriguez.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out too that John from the planning who deals with them, he stated that we couldn't avoid something in planning as well. And maybe that was what he was speaking to, uses added on as an amendment.
I think John is still with us, so I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I'm still here if you'd like me to comment.
Yes, please, John. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with, I understand the sentiment. Let's get the licensing done, and certainly think your CAO has been very clear on an approach that could work, and I would agree with that. But I don't see, and other staff have now commented on the need for a zoning amendment. I don't see how you can do one without the other, but that doesn't mean that you don't. You want to focus on the licensing bylaw. That's fair. I hear that, and that's, you know, your citizens and residents, taxpayers want this dealt with quickly. That's also fair. And I think all of that can be done, but you've got some housekeeping amendments for sure to the zoning that you're going to need to deal with, the parking being the most obvious one to me. It sounds like you got the site plan control item sorted from what I was gathering, and I think that's a separate item as well. I don't think that's crucial right now, but that's something that Ken can deal with staff. I would imagine that's a staff processing item. So there are some details, but I don't think you need to worry about those tonight. But I think the direction is pretty clear, but you're going to have to deal with the zoning at some level, at some point.
All right, thank you.
Your worship, perhaps if I could suggest an alternative motion, and I showed it to Councillor Bojan simply to keep it simple. Direct staff to prepare short-term vacation rental regulations for public feedback. It's open in general. It's not getting into the weeds of, is it going to be a zoning bylaw amendment? Is it going to be a licensing bylaw? If it's one or both, we're going to do that. We're going to set up the public consultation, and then as part of that process, we're going to go through all of these legal reviews that are going to as well.
Yeah, Clerk is preparing that. Is council comfortable with that suggestion?
Yeah, I am.
All right, Councillor Bojan, you moved it, and Councillor Van Clavers seconded. Are you okay with that? Councillor Wolvett, do you have your hand up for question?
Well, I just going through some of the letters that we received, even one of the most recent ones. I know that the public zeroed in on this owner having to be present. And this latest letter lists even Sarnia. Please be advised that in any residential zone, the short-term accommodation may only be permitted in the principal residence of the short-term operator. Then it goes down, lists a bunch of other cities. I know that through the public meetings, the people that really insist on that the owner should be present. So, I mean, we went through all the ownership thing, but people that I heard in these rooms and what you reported to us, a lot of people kind of insist on that, but I think we've kind of steered away from that now, ownership. We're not really addressing that. So I think what we're coming up with here tonight and moving forward is we're okay with short-term rentals wherever they may be, as long as they follow the rules. That's kind of how follow the licensing rules, and kind of how I'm summing it up. We're not restricting any short-term rentals in residential areas or anything like that people have been opposed to in their letters. And there was also another topic discussed, what the term is a commercial operator. So like, for instance, we had people in here that own a couple of houses and they're these things out making money and income tax and all that. So I think that's where we're going, that we're not zeroing in on owner. The owner has to be in the residence.
Your worship, the best way to describe it is that we had some legal review to do of the two. So there wasn't any specific or clear direction on it. So this is where I go back to. When you have your public consultation, whatever bylaw you have before you, you do not have to make a decision on at that time. So we can bring this before you, and there's tools and options that we can provide you at that meeting. That if at the end of the day, what you've given us firm direction on, or perhaps we need to go and get legal advice on, you're still not happy with whatever we come up with, there's options for you. So I would say we have some conversations with your legal folks that we need to understand certain things on. Frankly, I don't think some of you are going to like what we end up bringing back, just preview coming attractions. That's just the nature of how it works. But then council can direct us at that public meeting to say, okay, well, we didn't really give you direction and here's what you came back with, but we're not happy with that. So go and do this.
Council's gonna have an opportunity before the public meeting. Whatever's gonna go to the public is gonna be vetted at least once, if not more, by council. So we're not gonna create a bylaw and then send it straight out for public consultation. We're gonna create the bylaw. Council's gonna endorse it in draft. Then it will be sent for public consultation. Then you'll receive those comments back and decide whether you want to make further changes or you want to pass it as it is. So we have a number of steps along the way.
Exactly.
And that'll be vetted by legal
And
before we get to the.
Fair enough.
Okay, so I've got this motion. And you. Okay, I have a motion by Council Bojan, seconded by Councilor Van Clever. That the presentation by Randy Burke, planner regarding short-term rentals in Plympton-Wyoming be received and that staff be directed to draft a bylaw licensing short-term rentals for public feedback. Mover, seconders, are you comfortable with that?
I think we were saying you just prepare short-term vacation rental regulations.
Based on what Mr. Spancy just said, prepared for council.
Yeah, that's, I wrote that and then I think it needs to be changed again.
Yeah. I think, for your worship, what I had suggested in my motion was to prepare for public feedback, but based on what Mr. Savansky is saying, I would just change it for council feedback.
Protocol is comes to council first.
Based on what Mr. Savansky is suggesting, yes.
Supper's cold now, Mike.
Cold is packed up, it's gone.
Deputy Clerk.
The one thing that I want to comment on about short-term vacation rentals, I thought we were getting away from the short-term vacation and just leaving it at short-term rentals.
Yes, yeah, STR, whatever you want to, whatever acronym is appropriate.
So I'll read that again, that the presentation by Randy Burke, planner regarding the short-term rentals in Plympton-Wyoming be received and that staff be directed to draft a bylaw licensing short-term rentals for council feedback. Dr. All those in favor? Carry.
It's a tough.
So just again, that you've heard, for those that are watching, is virtually nothing has been set in stone tonight. It's been a great exercise in democracy and discussion. I want to thank our planner Randy Burke, as well as Mr. Melanson, John from NPG, and Brian Nada for joining with us. You've done an excellent job in pulling this evening together. To our planning technician, Lisa, welcome back. Thank you for joining with us tonight, as well as to you, Ella, for your assistance. Deputy Clerk for filling in, and DC Jordan, thank you for your input. We certainly do appreciate that. I have a motion by Councillor Wolvette, seconded by Councillor Vasey, that the special council meeting be adjourned. All those in favor?
I might.
Think about it, Mike.
You going in the kitchen to get leftovers?